Think about the choices you make every single day. Most of them feel completely minor. You choose what to eat for breakfast, which route to take to work, or whether to say hello to a stranger. You do not spend hours agonizing over these decisions because they seem totally harmless. But life has a very strange way of working. Sometimes, the smallest, most insignificant choice you make can set off a massive chain reaction. A single moment can ripple outward and completely reshape your entire future, or even the lives of millions of other people around the globe. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible stories of real people who made simple choices that led to some of the most famous, unexpected turning points in modern history. And as you will see, none of them could have possibly guessed where their actions would lead. Our first story begins on a cold morning on the 17th of January, 1977. A 36-year-old man named Gary Gilmore was walking slowly across a yard towards an old abandoned canned food factory in Draper, Utah. He was not alone. In fact, Gary was surrounded by several heavily armed prison guards. The guards were tense. They kept their hands close to their weapons because they were terrified that Gary might try to make a run for it. They thought he might break away and force them to shoot him right there in the yard. But the truth was, Gary had absolutely no intention of running. He had been waiting for this exact moment for months, and he was completely ready. So, Gary kept walking, his boots crunching on the cold ground, flanked by the guards. He did not hesitate for a single second when they reached the entrance of the concrete building. He just stepped inside. The interior of the old factory was massive, cold, and completely empty. There was no machinery left, no boxes, nothing. It was just a giant, cavernous space with concrete floors and high ceilings. But way across the room, pushed up against the far back wall, sat a single wooden chair. Gary did not need to be told what to do. He immediately began walking across the empty concrete floor directly toward that chair. When he reached it, he turned around and sat down. As soon as he was seated, the guards moved in quickly. They took thick leather straps and began securing his wrists and his ankles to the wooden chair so he could not move at all. Throughout this entire process, Gary did not struggle. He did not say a word. He did not even look at the guards. Instead, his eyes were locked on the opposite side of the empty room. On the far wall, directly across from where Gary was strapped down, was a large, heavy black curtain. It looked like someone had wheeled out a stage curtain to block the view of whatever was behind it. And as Gary stared at this curtain, he noticed there were 5 small, evenly spaced slots cut into the fabric. Gary could not see through those dark slots, but he knew exactly what was behind them. He knew that at each of those 5 stations, a police officer was standing with a loaded rifle. They were the firing squad, and they were there because Gary himself had specifically requested them. To understand how Gary ended up in this chair, we have to go back to the summer of 1976. Gary was a troubled man who had spent most of his adult life in and out of reform schools and prisons for various crimes. But in July of 1976, his behavior turned incredibly violent. Over the course of just 2 days, Gary robbed and murdered 2 innocent young men in Utah. First, he shot Max Jensen, a gas station attendant who complied with all of his demands. The very next night, he shot Benny Bushnell, a student working at a motel. Both men did exactly what Gary asked, but he killed them anyway. Gary was caught almost immediately, put on trial, and convicted of murder. In October of 1976, the jury sentenced him to death. Now, at the time, this was a massive deal. The United States had not executed anyone in nearly 10 years due to a Supreme Court ruling on the death penalty. Gary's case was going to be the first execution in a decade, and it sparked a huge media storm. Almost immediately, people stepped in to try and stop it. Gary's own mother, along with organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union, filed multiple appeals to try and get his sentence changed to life in prison. But while most death row inmates would have been grateful for the help, Gary was furious. He did not want to spend the rest of his life locked in a concrete box. He believed that life without parole was a fate far worse than death. And so, Gary fought against his own lawyers. He pushed the courts to go ahead with the execution as quickly as possible. Under Utah law at the time, death row inmates were allowed to choose how they wanted to die. They could choose hanging, or they could choose a firing squad. Gary chose the firing squad. And so, after months of legal battles, his request was finally granted. Now, back in the abandoned cannery, the guards finished tightening the leather straps on Gary's wrists and ankles. They stepped away, leaving him alone in the chair. Then, a prison chaplain walked over. He stood beside Gary and read him his last rites. When he finished, the chaplain looked down at Gary and asked him if he had any final words he wanted to share with the world. Gary did not hesitate. He looked up at the chaplain, completely calm, and simply said, "Let's do it." The chaplain nodded, stepped back, and signaled to the men behind the curtain. 5 rifle barrels poked through these small slots in the black fabric. A moment later, a loud blast echoed through the cavernous room, and Gary Gilmore was dead. At this point, you might be wondering how this dark story has anything to do with a small choice changing the world. Well, we have to fast forward 10 years to the year 1987. In Portland, Oregon, a young marketing executive named Dan Whedon was sitting in a conference room at his advertising agency, Whedon and Kennedy. Dan and his team had recently signed a new client. It was a sports shoe company that had a lot of potential, but they were struggling. They were trying desperately to compete with Reebok, which was absolutely dominating the fitness market at the time. This shoe company had hired Dan to create a massive breakthrough marketing campaign that would help them stand out and become a household name. But the problem was Dan and his team were completely stuck. For hours, they sat in that meeting room, tossing around different ideas and pitches. They wanted something that would connect with serious, hardcore athletes, but also with ordinary people who were just trying to get off the couch and go for a jog. Every idea they came up with felt flat. Nothing had that punch they needed. Dan was getting more and more frustrated as the hours ticked by. And then, completely out of nowhere, Dan had a sudden epiphany. He was not even sure why the thought entered his mind, but he suddenly found himself thinking about the execution of Gary Gilmore from 10 years earlier. Like millions of other Americans, Dan had watched the news coverage of the execution back in 1977. And for some strange reason, as he sat in that frustrating meeting, he remembered the very last words Gary had spoken right before the rifles fired. Dan thought about the phrase, "Let's do it." It was incredibly simple. It was direct, and it possessed a strange, rugged determination. It was about taking action without overthinking, without making excuses. But Dan thought the phrase could be just a little bit stronger. He decided to tweak it slightly to make it sound more universal. He changed the word let's to the word just. And so, the phrase became, "Just do it." Dan pitched the 3-word slogan to his client, which was Nike. At first, the executives at Nike actually hated it. Phil Knight, the co-founder of the company, thought it was a terrible idea and a waste of money. But Dan convinced them to trust his instinct and run with it. In 1988, Nike launched their first commercial featuring the new slogan showing an 80-year-old man running across the Golden Gate Bridge. The campaign was an overnight sensation. The slogan resonated deeply with people all over the world. Within just a few years, Nike's sales skyrocketed, doubling their business and turning them into the multi-billion-dollar global empire they are today. All because a creative director in Oregon randomly remembered the final words of a convicted killer facing a firing squad. Our second story takes us to the city of London in the year 2009. A 23-year-old aspiring actor named Chris was walking down a busy street on his way to a date. Chris was incredibly stressed out. He had very little money in his bank account, and he was struggling to pay his rent. He desperately needed a big break, and he was hoping that his luck was about to change because the very next morning he had an incredibly important job interview. But for tonight, Chris had to focus on his date. He wanted to make a good impression, but his empty wallet made things very difficult. He could not afford a fancy restaurant or a nice bar. And so, as they walked through the chilly London air, Chris made a choice. he decided to take his date into a local McDonald's. Now, this McDonald's was not a romantic spot. It was extremely loud, the floors were sticky, and it was absolutely packed with people who had been out drinking. But it was the only thing Chris could afford. He looked at his date, feeling a bit embarrassed, and asked if this was okay. She was incredibly understanding. She just smiled, told him it was perfectly fine, and they got in line to order. After they got their food, they turned around to find a place to sit. But the restaurant was so crowded that every single table was completely full. Chris and his date began walking through the dining area, looking for any open spot. Finally, Chris spotted a table where a single man was sitting by himself. The man was quiet, minding his own business, and eating his meal. Crucially, there were 2 empty chairs at his table. Chris walked over, trying to be as polite as possible, and asked the man if they could sit in the empty chairs. He promised they would not bother him and would leave as soon as they finished eating. The man looked up, shrugged, and told them to go ahead. Chris and his date sat down, and they began to eat and talk. But the problem was, Chris was incredibly distracted. His mind kept drifting to the massive job interview he had scheduled for the next morning. He was so anxious about it that he was barely paying attention to the conversation. He just wanted to finish his food, walk his date home, and go to bed so he could be fully rested and focused for the interview. As Chris sat there lost in his thoughts, he suddenly realized that the atmosphere at the table had completely changed. The man sitting across from them had stopped eating. He had turned his head and was now staring directly at Chris's date. The look on his face was not friendly at all. It was aggressive and intensely uncomfortable. Before Chris could even ask what was going on, the stranger opened his mouth and began hurling incredibly cruel insults at Chris's date. He started making fun of the way she looked and the way she talked. Chris was stunned. He looked at his date, then back at the man, trying to understand why this stranger was suddenly attacking them out of nowhere. But the man did not stop. He looked directly at the young woman and called her an ugly pig. Now, Chris had never been in a physical fight in his entire life. He was a gentle guy, and he hated violence. On top of that, Chris was not a particularly large man. He stood at about 5 feet, 8 inches tall. But hearing this stranger brutally insult his date was more than he could take. He decided he had to stand up for her. Chris stood up from his chair, looked at the man, and told him to get up. But as soon as the stranger stood up, Chris realized he had made a massive mistake. The man was an absolute giant. He towered over Chris, blocking out the bright fluorescent lights of the restaurant. But Chris knew he could not back down now. He took a deep breath, wound up his fist, and punched the giant man right in the face. It did not go well. The punch barely registered, and the massive stranger immediately proceeded to beat the living crap out of Chris right there in the middle of the crowded McDonald's. He threw Chris to the ground, hitting him repeatedly while the other customers watched in shock. By the time the giant finally stopped and wandered out of the restaurant into the night, Chris was bruised, bleeding, and utterly humiliated. Chris and his date left the restaurant immediately. Chris kept apologizing over and over again, feeling like a complete failure. His date tried to reassure him, but they were both incredibly shaken up. They went their separate ways, and Chris went home, crawling into bed with his body aching. The next morning, Chris woke up early. He walked into his bathroom, looked in the mirror, and gasped. His face was a total mess. He had a massive, swollen black eye, and his jaw was deeply bruised. He looked like he had just escaped a war zone. Chris felt a wave of pure panic. He was supposed to walk into a high-end professional job interview in just a couple of hours. He wondered if he should just call and cancel. How could anyone take him seriously when he looked like a street brawler? But Chris knew this was the biggest opportunity of his career. He decided he could not let his fear ruin his chances. He put on his best suit, walked out the door, and headed to the interview. When he arrived at the office, he was escorted into a room with the interviewers. As soon as he walked in, he could feel their eyes lock onto his massive black eye. It was incredibly awkward. Nobody asked him about it, and Chris did not want to explain that he had gotten beaten up at a McDonald's the night before. He just tried to remain confident, deliver his lines, and ignore the physical pain in his face. By the end of the meeting, Chris was convinced he had completely blown it. He thanked them for their time and left the building, assuming he would never hear from them again. But a few days later, Chris received a phone call that would change his life forever. It turned out that the interviewers did not hate his black eye at all. In fact, they absolutely loved it. You see, the job Chris was interviewing for was not an office job. It was an audition for a starring role in a massive new fantasy television series. The character they were casting was a gritty, battle-hardened young warrior who constantly found himself in dangerous, violent situations. When Chris had walked into the room looking like he had just been in a real fistfight, the casting directors realized they did not need to use makeup to make him look tough. He looked completely authentic, rugged, and real. They offered Chris the role on the spot. That television show was Game of Thrones, and Chris was cast as the legendary character Jon Snow. Today, the world knows him by his stage name, Kit Harington. He went from being a broke, young actor who could barely afford a cheap meal to a global superstar nominated for multiple Emmy and Globe Awards. All because he made the brave, impulsive choice to stand up to a giant in a London McDonald's. Our third story takes us back to the year 1925, to the campus of Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. A 21-year-old college senior named Ted was sitting inside his dorm room surrounded by his closest friends. The group had managed to get their hands on a bottle of gin, and they were busy pouring drinks and celebrating. Now, to understand the gravity of this situation, we have to remember the time period. In 1925, the United States was in the middle of Prohibition. The law made the manufacture and consumption of alcohol completely illegal. It did not matter that they were 21 years old. Having that bottle of gin in their dorm room was a serious crime that could result in arrest. But Ted was willing to take the risk because he had so much to celebrate. He was a brilliant senior who was about to graduate with high honors. More importantly, he had just been named the editor-in-chief of Dartmouth's humor magazine, The Jack-O-Lantern. For Ted, this was a massive deal. He had dreams of becoming a professional writer and cartoonist. Being the editor was the perfect stepping stone to a successful career. So, feeling incredibly happy and successful, Ted took a drink and passed the bottle around. But as the night went on and they got louder, they suddenly heard a loud knock on the door. The room went silent. Ted got up, opened the door, and his heart sank. Standing in the hallway were two police officers and the college dean. Ted and his friends were caught red-handed. Fortunately, the police decided not to press criminal charges, so nobody went to jail. The school also decided not to expel Ted or his friends, allowing them to graduate. But the school still handed down a severe punishment. Dartmouth stripped Ted of his academic honors and forced him to step down from his position as editor-in-chief of the Jack-O-Lantern. To make matters worse, the dean decreed that he was completely banned from submitting any writing or drawings to the magazine. Ted was devastated. Losing the position felt like his entire future was being ripped away. He spent days in his room wondering how he would ever get his career off the ground if he could not even publish his work in a college paper. At first, Ted thought about pleading with the dean to lift the ban. But he knew the administration was incredibly strict, and they were definitely not going to change their minds. He was completely stuck. But then, Ted had a brilliant idea. He realized that while he was banned from submitting work under his own name, the magazine's staff still accepted submissions from the general public. They did not always verify the identity of the people sending in cartoons. So, Ted made a clever choice. He decided to create a secret identity, a pen name. He drew a series of new cartoons and signed them with a completely different name. He decided to use his middle name, which was his mother's maiden name. The name he chose was Seuss. Ted quietly submitted his drawings to the magazine under his new pseudonym. The new editorial staff at the Jack-O-Lantern had absolutely no idea that the submissions were coming from the banned former editor. They looked at the drawings, fell in love with the unique, whimsical art style, and immediately published them. Ted was thrilled. Not only was he able to keep doing what he loved, but he actually found a strange sense of freedom in writing and drawing under a fake name. It allowed him to be more creative and playful than ever before. He kept up the ruse for the rest of his senior year, graduating without the school ever finding out. And after graduation, when Ted decided to pursue writing and illustrating full-time, he chose to keep using that very same pen name. He added the prefix Doctor to the beginning of it, partly as a joke because his father had always wanted him to go to medical school and become a doctor. Over the course of his long and legendary career, Ted would write and illustrate over 60 books under his famous pen name. His stories would capture the imaginations of hundreds of millions of children and adults all over the world, teaching generations of kids how to read and winning him a Pulitzer Prize. Ted's full name was Theodore Geisel, but the entire world knows him simply as Dr. Seuss. All because a college senior decided to share a bottle of gin with his friends on a quiet night in 1925, got caught, and had to find a creative way to beat the system. It is truly mind-blowing to think about how these lives were fully reshaped by moments that seemed so small. A desperate man facing a firing squad speaks 3 words that become the face of a giant sports empire. A young actor gets into a violent restaurant fight and walks away with the role of a legendary hero. A college kid gets caught with a bottle of illegal gin and ends up creating a famous pen name. We are all always just one small, unexpected choice away from a completely different destiny. Did these stories make you realize how one small decision can change everything? Or are you ready for what comes next? Kenika Jenkins, who was 19 years old at the time, was getting ready to make plans to go out with her friends on the evening of Friday, the 8th of September, 2017. She was going to go out with her pals. It was the kind of night that seemed to be full with potential that had not yet been realized. The kind of night that many of us remember from when we were that age. An invitation to a birthday party had been made to Kenika and her 3 friends, and it was not any ordinary party of any type. Kenika and her friends have been invited to attend. The Crowne Plaza Chicago O'Hare Hotel, which had an aura of refinement and a touch of glitz, was the location of the event that was being conducted. They were all overjoyed and happy. To get to the hotel, which was located in the neighborhood of Rosemont and was in close proximity to the airport, they got into their vehicle and drove there. The hotel was located in Rosemont. While they were driving, they were laughing and talking about the night that was going to come, and the lights of Chicago offered a backdrop that was familiar to them. Around 11 o'clock on that particular evening, they arrived at the parking lot of the hotel where they were staying. As soon as they discovered a parking spot, they got out of the van and made their way into the lobby of the Crowne Plaza, which was a well-lit area. If we were to claim that the atmosphere was typical of a hotel that was filled on a Friday night, we would be understating the situation. In addition to checking in and going to the bar, there was a steady stream of individuals coming and going during the whole day. The group of friends that Kenika was with made their way to the elevator and then proceeded to rise to the 9th floor before arriving at their destination. Room 926 was the location where the event was held. As soon as they opened the door to the room where they were staying, the celebration had already begun in full swing. There were a significant number of people, including friends and friends of friends, who were jammed into the small hotel room despite its limited space. At the same time that people were dancing and the music was playing at a loud volume, beverages were freely passed from one person to another. As they had anticipated, the setting was brimming with life and vitality, which was exactly what they had brought with them. Kenika and her friends joined in very quickly when the news broke. There was a whirlwind of music, laughter, and conversation, and the hours began to blend together and became less distinct as the conversation continued. When Kenika arrived at the party, she was drinking much like a large number of other individuals who were there. As the night went, it became increasingly apparent to a few of the other individuals who were attending the party that she was becoming quite intoxicated. This was the case since she was getting more and more drunk. At one point, when they attempted to give Kanika a hug, they discovered that she was so unsteady on her feet that she was unable to stand up on her own. Later on, a witness who was present at the moment provided this information to the detectives who were conducting the investigation. Another witness recalled seeing Kanika after some time had passed, and they both recalled seeing her. While the most of the people were standing up and dancing around in reaction to the music, Kanika was sitting on the edge of the bed, which was situated off to the side. Kanika was taking a seat on the edge of the bed. It appeared as though she lacked the stamina and coordination required to even stand up, let alone dance, based on the manner in which she held herself. The mere act of sitting there gave the impression that she was unable to deal with the quantity of alcohol that she had ingested. It has been a couple of hours since that earlier time. It was sometime about 3 o'clock in the morning when the event took place. The celebration was beginning to wind down when Kanika and the 3 friends that she had brought with her to the party came to the conclusion that it was time to call it a night and head back home, despite the fact that they had been celebrating for quite some time. After saying their goodbyes to one another, the 2 of them made their way through the bustling area and then exited onto the corridor on the 9th level, which was quite calm on that level. As the 4 of them made their way down the lengthy corridor in the direction of the elevators, the hotel's security cameras would eventually record them as they made their way down the corridor. After a long night out, they gave the impression of being any other group of young people that they could have been of any other age. All the way down to the ground floor where they exited the elevator, they were transported by the elevator, which brought them all the way down. Following their departure from the building, they entered the main lobby, which had grown noticeably less boisterous in comparison to the time when they had initially arrived. Just as they were beginning to make their way towards the main door, Kanika suddenly came to a complete and utter halt. She had the intention of heading out to the parking lot and locating their vehicle. At first, she was checking her pockets, and then she checked her handbag. She was getting ready to leave. When she gazed at her face, she gave off the impression of being confused. Nevertheless, she was devoid of the keys to her vehicle. In addition to that, she was unable to place her cell phone anywhere in the vicinity. She took the time to explain to her pals that she must have overlooked the people who were still present in the establishment. They were able to establish control of the situation, despite the fact that Kanika was substantially more intoxicated than her friends were at the time. When they shifted their attention to Kanika, it was clear that she was having trouble standing and keeping her head in an upright position. They told her to come to a stop and wait in this location. Ensure that you continue to be present in this very lobby. We will have to return to room 926 inches order to find your stuff for you. We apologize for the inconvenience. At first glance, it seemed like a basic approach. The moment Kanika gave a little nod, her companions turned around and headed back in the direction of the elevators, leaving her to be by herself in the lobby. The group of her friends returned to the party room, which was situated on the 2nd story of the building. First, they spent a few minutes searching the disorganized room for her pocketbook, and then they finally found it. On the other hand, they were not successful in their exploration. Both her cell phone and one of her keys were discovered inside the house. It was clear that they had been successful in achieving their goals. After leaving the party for the 2nd time, they ultimately made their way back down to the lobby in order to meet up with Kanika. They did this with a sense of relief before leaving the party. Nevertheless, there were no people present in the foyer upon the opening of the elevator doors and their departure from the elevator, because he was no longer present. They looked around, considering the likelihood that she had most likely just gone outside to get some fresh air. They were thinking about this possibility. Upon exiting the primary door, they proceeded to explore the surrounding region and take in their surroundings. It is not true, she was not there. Currently, it seemed as though they were not really concerned about the situation. After some consideration, they arrived at the conclusion that she must have become exhausted from waiting, and as a result, she ultimately chose to walk out to the car by herself. The 3 of them began going through the parking lot till they found their vehicle. This was done in order to locate their automobile. Nevertheless, Kanika was not there when they got at the area where they were waiting. In addition to the fact that she was not inside the vehicle, she was also not standing in any geographical vicinity to it. Suddenly, a glimmer of worry started to creep into my consciousness. I was concerned about something. The fact that their buddy was incredibly intoxicated, in addition to the fact that it was the middle of the night, left them completely confused about where she was. In addition, they were in possession of her phone, which meant that they were unable to even call her in order to inquire about her location. Teresa Martin, Kanika's mother, should be approached as the next logical step, according to the conclusion that they reached via their investigation. After taking out their phone, one of the pals called the number that had been provided to them from the list of available numbers. When Teresa picked up the phone in the middle of the night, she was immediately overtaken with a feeling of dread. This feeling occurred very quickly. As a result of the physical distance that separated them, the voice of the friend of her daughter who was on the other end of the line sounded peculiar. The events that had taken place were described in detail by them. They informed her that they had just left the party that was held at the Crown Plaza after they had left the party. Because Kanika was unable to find either her phone or her keys, they had left her in the lobby so that she could go look for them. This was done so that she could go and find them. After returning to the ground, they were unable to locate her anywhere in the area. Teresa was given the assurance that they had her phone and keys and that everything was probably fine, but they were unable to locate Kanika. Teresa was offered this assurance. Teresa's thoughts seemed to be racing at a quick pace. It was a straightforward inquiry that she addressed to them. Were any of you drinking any alcohol? A little lull occurred in the conversation that was taking place on the other end of the line. Both of the friends gave off the impression of being anxious and guarded. The situation was minimized by them, and they replied something along the lines of, "Oh no, maybe a drink or two." They continued to go on and on about how certain they were that Kanika was doing well for herself. However, when it came to Teresa, her instincts as a mother were screaming that something was horribly, extremely wrong. She was concerned about her daughter. Despite the fact that it was 3:30 in the morning, her daughter had not been seen for a considerable amount of time, and her friends were completely unaware of her disappearance. The fact that she would be arriving to the hotel on her own was something that she shared with them. At some point in the future, she was going to recover her children. Teresa Martin came at the Crown Plaza Hotel at a time that was quite close to 5 o'clock in the morning. The sun had not yet risen at that precise instant in time. She entered the tranquil lobby with the idea of locating Kanika, and she did it with a single, unwavering goal in mind. The first thing that she did was to go right to the front desk, and this was the first thing that she did. An explanation of the issue was provided by her to the manager who was on duty at the time. She shared with him the news that her daughter, Kanika Jenkins, had been present at a party that was situated on the 9th degree. It was stated by her that her companions had discovered her in this very same lobby the last time they saw her, but that she had disappeared since that time. Although Teresa made an effort to keep her calm, it is clear that she is in a desperate state of mind because of the tone of her voice. However, despite the fact that I am certain that she is doing well, we are unable to find her. Due to the fact that her friends have access to her phone, I am unable to get in touch with her. Would it be feasible for you to take a brief look at the footage that was captured by your security cameras in order to figure out where she went? We are unable to determine if she has left the hotel, or whether she is still present somewhere within the establishment, or whether she has departed the hotel. Viewing the video footage is all that is required of us at this time. It appeared as though the request, which was made by a mother who was experiencing fear, was reasonable. The personnel at the hotel, on the other hand, was completely and utterly unyielding in their refusal. She was advised by the management that they were unable to share her with the footage that was captured by the protection system. His point was that it was against the policy of the hotel to show a film to a guest who had not yet filed an official report with the police regarding a missing person. He believed that this was a violation of the hotel's policy. In spite of the fact that this is a widely accepted rationale, it is not necessarily legally required in the majority of situations. It is possible for a hotel to collaborate with other establishments in the event of an emergency situation in order to provide assistance in the search for a person who may be in danger. But this management was inflexible in their approach. No support was offered by him in any way. It was explained to Teresa by him that in order for her to watch the movie, she would first have to go and file a complaint for a missing person. Teresa was taken aback by the news. She was feeling more and more afraid with each passing minute, and she was becoming increasingly agitated. At the same time that time was running out, those individuals who were in a position to provide assistance to her continued to maintain their obstinate unwillingness to do so. Teresa, who was under the notion that she had no other choice, left the lobby of the hotel and stood outside in the chilly early morning hours. She was under the impression that she had no other options. After removing her own phone from her pocket, she dialed the number for the police department. In addition, she offered an additional explanation on the entire incident. In spite of the fact that the hotel had surveillance footage that could reveal the location of her child's whereabouts, they refused to show it to her without first receiving a complaint from the authorities. A search for her daughter was conducted at the motel. She repeatedly pleaded with the dispatcher to send an officer to this location in order to persuade them to show us the movie. Despite the fact that the officers were eager to listen to her, it seemed as though they did not share her sense of urgency over the matter. She requested, "Can you please send an officer down here?" When viewed from their perspective, it seemed as though this was a situation that occurred rather regularly. A young person who was 19 years old was present at the party that was being held. Overindulging in alcohol was her habit. She left on her own accord. Every single time it happens to be the case. Teresa was advised that her daughter was most likely with other friends and that it was possible that she had returned to a separate room in the hotel in order to get some rest. Teresa was also informed that it was possible that her daughter took a nap. They advised her to exercise patience and wait for a couple of hours before making any decisions. Be sure to check and see if Kanika is present. It is possible that she will call them once again in the event that she has not yet arrived by that time. Teresa was now feeling a double dosage of frustration as a result of the situation. In the beginning, there was the hotel, and now there are the police. Nobody took her seriously. She was not being taken seriously. At first glance, it seemed as though no one could possibly comprehend the terror that she was going through. During the time that the sun was just about to rise, her daughter had been absent for a substantial amount of time. She came to the conclusion that she would go out and look for Kanika on her own in the case that no one else was ready to help her search for her. In no way was she going to do nothing but wait around. There was no way that she would do that. At the same time as she was making her way back into the hotel, her determination got greater. Following her ascent into an elevator, she made her way to the 9th floor, which was the location of the party that had been hosted earlier. Initially, she started pounding on doors at one end of the hallway, and then she worked her way to the opposite end of the hallway. From door to door, she knocked on each and every one of them. She went door to door. In the event that she received a response, she would question as to whether or not the individual had seen her daughter Kendall. She would query as to whether or not she was there in their chamber by describing her through the use of her description. There was a significant amount of time that she spent walking around the floors of that hotel. As she made her way from the 9th level to the 8th floor, and then from the 8th floor to the 7th floor, she not only questioned every person she saw, but also knocked on every door she encountered. She was a single mother who was on a mission. She was frantic and frightened about the situation. Despite this, she was not making any headway at all. It was impossible to find Kanika anywhere. This continued to take place all throughout the morning and into the afternoon, even after it had already begun. After Kanika had been seen for the remaining time, the administration of the hotel eventually found out where Teresa was located at roughly 1:15 inches the afternoon. This was nearly 10 hours after Kanika had been seen for the last time. They came to the realization that she was actively searching for her daughter by going from one residence to another in an effort to find her. In addition, rather than offering to help her, they went ahead and reported her to the authorities. They not only filed a report of trespassing against her, but they also issued an order that she be removed from the residential property. In light of this, law enforcement officers arrived at the Crown Plaza for the second time on that particular day. Nevertheless, they were present this time in order to deal with Teresa during this particular instance. As soon as she encountered the law enforcement officers, she was presented with a fresh opportunity. It was with great urgency that she approached them and pleaded with them to reconsider their decision. My daughter has not been seen or heard from since 10 hours ago. I have not been able to locate her. I myself am in possession of it. We are currently in possession of her keys. My attempts to get in touch with her have been unsuccessful. It would be really appreciated if you could request that the hotel give you a copy of the surveillance film. After being approached by a mother who was obviously not going to give up, the police officers complied with the request this time around. Teresa accompanied the officers as they made their way to the front desk, where they gave the manager the information that they needed access to the CCTV film. After receiving their request, the staff at the hotel showed them the footage that they had requested. On the other hand, the only cameras that were shown to them were those that were situated in close proximity to the principal entrances of the hotel. The film was evaluated by both the law enforcement officers and the security personnel working at the hotel. It was during the late hours of the previous night that they were able to see Kanika making her way into the hotel with her friends. In spite of this, they never once saw her leave the area when they were going over the hours of tape. According to the information that we have, it does not appear that Kanika has left through any of the principal entrances. It seemed as though this was abundantly plenty for both the law enforcement and the motel establishment. After that, they switched their focus to Teresa and were on the verge of saying, well, there you have it. She is still present in a particular area of the hotel. They were under the impression that their task was complete. After seeing the movie that was shown to them, they were able to formulate a straightforward response to the question. There is no attempt made to seek information regarding the existence of additional cameras. Could you please confirm whether or not there is surveillance equipment installed in the basement, the service areas, and the corridors? The investigation had been completed at this point in time due to its conclusion. Following that, they conveyed to Teresa the news that they were no longer able to contribute to her assistance. Furthermore, due to the fact that the hotel had filed a complaint, she was no longer allowed to remain on the grounds with the goal of conducting a search. She was left with no other option but to leave, and the result was that her heart was broken in the process. Her hunt for answers was fruitless, and at this time she was unable to even look for her child on her own. She was at a loss for explanations. Teresa and her family were unable to see through the haze that was the remaining hours of the day, and they were filled with the most terrible suffering. It was impossible for them to assist. It was quite difficult for them to find Kanika within that hotel, despite the fact that she was most certainly located somewhere within the establishment. The initial idea that she had simply drifted out with friends or gone to another room grew less and less plausible with each passing hour. This was because she had been out for a longer period of time. Due to the fact that she had been absent for a considerable amount of time, this was the result. Both her phone and her keys were out of her possession. Her lack of communication with anyone was a problem. Despite the fact that her mother had spent a number of hours doing a comprehensive search of the public floors of the hotel, she had not been successful in locating her daughter. The passage of time itself was the one little detail that destroyed the idea, and it was the one thing that utterly demolished the core drunk teenager will turn up theory. extremely long periods of time had already elapsed. Something was wrong with the circumstance. A nagging feeling that had started in the middle of the night had now turned into a full-blown certainty for her family that Kanika was in extremely precarious circumstances. This realization came about as a result of all that had happened. Late that night, after what seemed like an eternity, someone or something shifted. 10 o'clock is the hour of the night. The Rosemont Police Department made the decision to go to the hotel and review the security footage once more on Saturday, 17 hours after Kanika had vanished without a trace. When they examined the material this time, they did it with a greater degree of caution. A number of factors may have contributed to this decision, including the realization that this was not a typical incident of a missing individual or the pressure that was exerted by the family. In this particular instance, they did not only look at the cameras that were covering the exits, they also looked at other cameras. They started looking through film from a number of different areas within the hotel where Kanika was staying in an effort to piece together a timeline of the activities that Kanika was known to have participated in before moving on. That was the period when they were successful in locating her. Through the use of a webcam feed that was recorded in the early hours of the morning, they were able to observe Kanika. The timestamp on the video indicated that it was 3:20 inches the morning immediately after her friends had left her in the lobby. This occurred just a short while after they had abandoned her. While Kanika was wandering about the motel, it was clear from the footage that she was completely by herself. There is little doubt that she was experiencing a severe case of disorientation. After exiting the main lobby area, she went in the direction of a staircase that led down rather than moving towards the exit or back to the guest elevators. She ultimately chose to take the stairway. The stairway was followed by her until she reached the bottom of the stairs. After making her way down the steps, she found herself in a part of the hotel that was not designed for use by guests. She might be found in a service corridor that was situated on the basement level of the main building. It was observed that she was walking along a lengthy corridor that was completely devoid of any individuals at any point over the course of the video. It was impossible for her to stand for an extended period of time. While she was lurching forward, she was making an effort to stabilize herself by crashing against the wall whenever she moved forward when she was moving forward. It appeared as though she was confused and disoriented. Immediately after that, the camera caught her as she rounded a corner and entered a large kitchen that was constructed out of stainless steel. This kitchen was not used at all throughout the time that it was being restored. To put it another way, it was essentially abandoned to the point that it was practically abandoned. In the course of her journey around the empty kitchen, she came across ovens and counters that were not being utilized by anyone. It was at that very moment that she stepped away from the camera's line of sight, which was situated at the opposite end of the kitchen. When the shot was taken, she was no longer showing up. The authorities maintained their monitoring efforts, employing a number of different camera angles in their investigations. In contrast, she was never captured on any other camera again after that point in time. Following the time when she left the kitchen, there was no more sighting of her. Now that they had a specific location from which to carry out their duties, the authorities were completely aware of the tasks that they needed to complete. Following their departure from the security office, they dashed straight down to the basement of the hotel, where they remained until they were no longer in danger. The exact halls that Kanika had gone through a few hours earlier were traversed by them as they made their way through the same vacant corridors. After entering the kitchen, there was a complete lack of any noise whatsoever. At this point, they began their search. The clock was ticking down to 1 o'clock in the morning, and it was still far beyond midnight. It was precisely the morning of Sunday. It had been close to 24 hours since Kanika's friends had last seen her. This meant that some of them had not seen her in quite some time. In addition, the unfortunate finale of the search for Kanika Jenkins took place in the kitchen where she was being detained. The police officers saw a massive freezer that was accessible to the general population. It was possible for them to open the enormous passageway. In addition to that, they found Kanika hidden away. Her existence had come to an end. As a result of the study, the events that took place during the perplexing minutes that she was dying were pieced together. After she had parted ways with her friends, Kanika, who was in a state of acute intoxication, had drifted off into the distance. After making her way down, she entered the kitchen of the hotel's basement, which was absolutely devoid of any presence. A walk-in freezer of considerable size and of commercial quality had been left on and unlocked for reasons that we may never be able to fully comprehend. The freezer had been left on. There was a door that was open. Kanika, who was probably looking for a spot to relax or rest because she was lost, entered the entryway. She must have been looking for a location to do so. The heavy door, which was constructed to close tightly and was insulated, swung shut behind her once she had left the room. Due to the fact that the door had already been shut, it would have been incredibly challenging, if not impossible, for someone in her position to open the door from the inside. Despite the fact that the majority of current refrigerators come equipped with an integrated safety release mechanism, it is extremely plausible that Kanika was unable to locate it or even realize what was happening place. Her death was brought on by hypothermia, which was brought on by the fact that she was confined inside the icy environment. Kanika's death was determined to have been the consequence of an accident, according to the official verdict of the medical examiner. Alcohol and topiramate, a medication that is taken for epilepsy and migraines, were discovered as significant contributory factors when it was concluded that hypothermia was the cause of death. Hypothermia was also recognized as the cause of death. From the perspective of her family and a sizable portion of the broader public, however, the narrative was not as straightforward as it may have appeared. The announcement of her passing and the unusual circumstances that accompanied it aroused an anger of unparalleled proportions. Irreverent circumstances surrounded her passing. The information that was brought to light regarding the hotel, as well as the initial response that the police department provided to the matter, shocked and outraged the general population significantly. Internet sleuths and concerned individuals began investigating every piece of evidence that was available, and when the conspiracy theories involving the alleged foul play were initially published, they began to spread like wildfire throughout the internet. In the eyes of the general public, the concept that a young woman could accidentally find herself confined inside a freezer in a major hotel was just incomprehensible. Nevertheless, in spite of all the rumors and speculation, the investigators could not discover any evidence to suggest that anyone else was contributing to her passing after they conducted their investigation. The most significant and puzzling question that has not yet been answered, on the other hand, has nothing to do with a conspiracy. Time is the major concern in this scenario. On the day when Teresa, Kanika's mother, arrived at that motel, it had been just 2 hours since Kanika had vanished without a trace. Earlier, she had urged with the employees to have a look at the surveillance cameras. When she was in a difficult situation, she had pleaded with them to help her. They were not in agreement. The police, upon receiving her call, did not take her worries into consideration and instead asked her to wait for additional instructions. On the other hand, what if they had looked at it? What would have happened if, at 5 or 6 in the morning, when Teresa was the first person to raise the alarm, the workers at the hotel had simply gone through all of the footage? As a result of their presence, they would have seen Kanika making her way into the basement by accident. They might have found her in the kitchen, which was a possibility considering the circumstances. A maximum of a couple of hours would have been the maximum amount of time that she would have spent in the freezer prior to that crucial period. Not only is it conceivable that she would have been alive all along, but it is also a chance that she would have been alive if she had in fact been alive. Tragically, not only is it a tragedy that Kanika Jenkins lost away, but it is also a tragedy that she could have been prevented from passing away to such a big degree. There was a window of opportunity when a rescue could have been performed. Nevertheless, that window of opportunity was allowed to close. The string of failures, which included the hotel's refusal to comply and the police's initial lack of urgency, were the reasons why there was a window of chance. Almost immediately after the occurrence, Teresa Martin filed a lawsuit against the Crowne Plaza Hotel, the security company that was employed by the hotel, and the restaurant that was leasing the cooking space. Many millions of dollars were the subject of the complaint that was filed. It was alleged in the complaint that they were careless in the sense that they did not adequately lock a potentially hazardous place, which was the walk-in freezer. In addition, it was asserted that the fact that they did not respond promptly to her requests for assistance was a direct factor in the passing of her daughter. Following a protracted legal struggle, the matter was ultimately settled out of court for a sum that was estimated to be greater than $6 million. Despite this, there is no amount of money that will ever bring Kanika back or erase the dreadful what-ifs that will continue to afflict her family. Neither one of these items is feasible at this time. They are left with the disheartening reality that the system that was intended to protect individuals failed their daughter at every single point of the process. They discovered that they were in this predicament without knowledge. In the final eerie film, Kanika can be seen wandering through the hotel's chilly and deserted hallways by herself. This footage serves as a heartbreaking final tribute to a life that was cut too short. In addition to this, it serves as a sobering reminder of how a series of decisions made by bureaucrats that appear to be of little significance can result in the most disastrous of outcomes. I want to express my gratitude for your presence here today. If you watched the program that was broadcast today, I would appreciate it if you could share your ideas with me in the comments area. Also, bear in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime waiting for you to watch in one sitting right now. You may watch all of these episodes in one sitting. Till the next time we meet again, what's going on? In the 1960s and 1970s, hitchhiking became incredibly popular among young people across America. It was a time defined by a spirit of counterculture, exploration, and a widespread sense of communal trust. Hitchhiking was viewed as a normal, socially acceptable, and highly efficient form of alternative transportation. The mechanics of it were simple and universally understood. A traveler would stand on the side of a busy highway, extend their arm, and hold their thumb upward to signal passing motorists that they needed a ride. If a driver felt inclined to help, they would pull over to the shoulder, the hitchhiker would hop into the vehicle, and they would set off toward a shared destination. Today, the idea of getting into a car with a complete stranger, or conversely, picking up an unknown person from the side of the road, seems unfathomably dangerous. Modern society views the practice with intense skepticism shaped by decades of cautionary tales. But in the late 1970s, it was still considered a routine way for a young person to travel across the vast expanses of the United States. It was with this mindset that 15-year-old Mary Vincent found herself standing on the side of a highway just outside of Modesto, California, on the 29th of September, 1978. Modesto was a city located in California's Central Valley, not terribly far from the bustling hub of San Francisco. Mary was a rebellious, fiercely independent teenager who had recently run away from her family home in Las Vegas, Nevada. Her parents were going through an incredibly bitter, hostile, and exhausting divorce, and the atmosphere inside her house had become entirely unbearable for her. Desperate to escape the emotional turmoil and constant arguments, Mary decided to leave. She used the universal network of hitchhiking to travel all the way from Las Vegas down to Los Angeles, California, where her grandfather lived. However, after spending just a couple of days at her grandfather's home, the reality of her situation began to set in. The initial adrenaline of running away faded, replaced by an overwhelming, suffocating wave of homesickness. Despite the chaos of her parents' crumbling marriage, Mary deeply missed her family, her siblings, and the comfort of the familiar. She desperately wanted to return to Las Vegas. One afternoon, while her grandfather was out of the house running errands, Mary decided to act on her feelings. She quietly slipped out of his home, carrying a small bag of personal belongings, and headed toward the highway to begin the long journey back to Nevada. Hitchhiking alone as a teenage girl was difficult and slow, but Mary managed to secure a series of rides that brought her northward from Los Angeles up to Modesto. The drivers who had helped her so far were ordinary, decent people who simply wanted to assist a traveling teenager. By the time she reached Modesto, she was positioned on a stretch of highway looking for another vehicle that could take her farther south and east back toward Las Vegas. On this particular afternoon, Mary was not entirely alone. She had grouped up with two other young hitchhikers who were also trying to travel down the coast. Together, the three teenagers stood in a small huddle on the shoulder of the road. To make their intentions completely clear to passing motorists, they were holding up cardboard signs that boldly read, "Going South." They hoped that traveling as a group would make them look safer and perhaps encourage a driver with a larger vehicle to pick them all up. In the middle of the afternoon, a light blue passenger van slowed down as it approached the trio. The van belonged to a man who appeared to be in his 50s. He looked completely ordinary, harmless, and unthreatening, the kind of older man who easily blended into a crowd. Seeing their signs, the driver pulled the van over to the side of the highway, parking about 15 feet ahead of where the teenagers were standing. Mary's two companions stayed back, waiting to see what the driver would say, while Mary eagerly ran forward to initiate the conversation. She walked up to the passenger side of the van, where the window had already been rolled down. Looking inside, she saw that the driver was alone, and the back of the van was completely wide open, offering plenty of space. Mary politely addressed the man, asking if he would be willing to give all three of them a ride, since they were all heading south. The man looked directly at Mary and shook his head. He replied in a calm but firm voice, stating that he could only give her a ride and that he would not accommodate the other two teenagers. Mary felt an immediate wave of confusion and hesitation. She looked past him into the interior of the light blue van, noting the abundance of empty space. There were no large boxes, no extra passengers, and no obvious reasons why three teenagers couldn't easily fit inside. She gently prodded the man, asking him if he was absolutely sure he couldn't take her friends along, emphasizing that they were all traveling to the exact same area. The man did not offer a complex explanation. He simply repeated himself with chilling finality, making it clear that he would take her, but he absolutely would not take the others. Sensing that this was her only immediate option, Mary told the driver to wait for a moment while she retrieved her bag. She walked back to her two companions and explained the driver's strict condition. Her friends instantly grew alarmed. They told Mary that something felt incredibly wrong about the situation. They pointed out that a normal, well-meaning driver with an empty van would have no logical reason to refuse two extra passengers who were heading in the exact same direction. They explicitly warned her not to get into the vehicle, sensing an unspoken danger. Mary harbored her own internal reservations. A small, quiet voice in her mind told her that her friends were right. But her intense desire to get home completely clouded her judgment. She was so deeply homesick, so physically exhausted from days of traveling, and so desperate to see her parents that she could not bear the thought of waiting on the highway's shoulder for another night. She knew that not every driver was willing to pick up hitchhikers, and she feared that if she turned this ride down, she might be stuck in Modesto for days. Overriding her instincts and ignoring the pleas of her companions, Mary grabbed her bag and told them that she was going to take the risk. She said goodbye, ran back to the waiting light blue van, opened the passenger door, and climbed inside. As soon as Mary sat down and pulled the door shut, the man immediately shifted the van into gear, pulled out onto the highway, and merged into the flow of traffic. Once they were cruising down the road, the driver turned to Mary with a polite smile and introduced himself. He said his name was Lawrence Singleton, and he confirmed that he was 50 years old. Mary introduced herself in return, and the two began to engage in casual, polite small talk. Lawrence was highly skilled at projecting an aura of safety and warmth. As they drove, his calm demeanor and gentle tone of voice completely put Mary at ease. Within a short period, her initial anxiety began to melt away entirely. To Mary, Lawrence did not look like a predator. He reminded her of her own grandfather, a kind, harmless older man who was simply doing a favor for a stranded teenager. Because she had been running on pure adrenaline and very little sleep for the past few days, the comforting environment of the moving van made Mary incredibly drowsy. She turned to Lawrence and asked if he would mind if she closed her eyes and took a quick nap while he drove. Lawrence smiled warmly and told her it was no problem at all, encouraging her to get some rest. Relieved, Mary curled up in the passenger seat, turned her body away from him, and closed her eyes. Within minutes, she fell into a deep, trusting sleep. A significant amount of time passed before Mary finally woke up. As her eyes adjusted and she looked out the passenger window, she noticed the positioning of the sun and the landmarks along the road. Her heart sank as she realized that the geography was entirely wrong. They were not traveling south towards Southern California and Nevada, they were heading in the exact opposite direction. Mary immediately turned to Lawrence and pointed out the error, telling him that they were going the wrong way. Lawrence acted surprised, hitting the steering wheel lightly and claiming that he had simply made a foolish navigational mistake. He apologized profusely, assuring her that he would find the next available exit, turn the van around, and get them back on the correct path. Mary nodded, trying to accept his excuse, but deep down, a profound sense of dread began to take root. They had traveled miles in the wrong direction. It felt statistically impossible for an experienced adult driver to make such a massive, prolonged error by accident. True to his word, however, Lawrence exited the highway, turned the light blue van around, and began driving south. This action temporarily confused Mary's instinct. If he was a dangerous kidnapper, why would he willingly turn the car back around toward her desired destination? Despite this, Mary remained completely on edge. Her senses were highly heightened, but she was careful to keep her face neutral and her voice calm. She knew she was trapped in a moving vehicle with an older, stronger adult, and she did not want to trigger an aggressive reaction by showing her intense fear or accusing him of lying. She sat silently in the passenger seat, watching the passing landscape with growing apprehension. Eventually, the van left the main interstate and entered a long, isolated stretch of secondary highway that wound through a heavily forested, densely wooded area. The surrounding trees grew thick and tall, blocking out much of the natural sunlight, and the traffic on this particular road completely thinned out until Lawrence's van was the only vehicle in sight. Suddenly, Lawrence broke the silence. He turned to Mary and announced that he needed to pull the van over immediately because he had to use the bathroom. Mary felt her stomach drop. The isolation of the forest was terrifying, but she tried to maintain her composure. She gave a tight, apprehensive nod and muttered that it was fine. As Lawrence began to slow the van down and steer it toward the edge of the road, Mary instinctively looked down at her own feet. She noticed that one of her sneakers had come completely untied. A sudden, sharp realization flashed through her mind. If this man tried to attack her, she would need to run as fast as possible, and a loose shoe would cause her to trip and fall. She knew she needed to tie the shoe immediately, but she was too terrified to bend down and do it while they were still in the front seats. The space was incredibly cramped, and she worried that making a sudden movement to tie her shoe would look highly suspicious to Lawrence, potentially causing him to launch an attack right there. She quickly decided that the moment the van came to a complete stop, she would open her door, step outside under the guise of stretching her legs, and immediately tie her laces on the solid ground. However, Lawrence did not simply pull over onto the dirt shoulder of the main road. Instead, he steered the light blue van onto a rugged, unpaved access road that cut deeply into the dense forest. As the van bumped along the dirt track, moving further and further away from the safety of the highway, absolute alarm bells began to scream inside Mary's head. She knew with absolute certainty that she was in profound danger. There was no innocent reason for a driver to navigate deep into an isolated forest just to relieve himself. Panic paralyzed her. She stared straight ahead, unable to look at Lawrence, her mind racing through every possible scenario. Should she try to jump out of the moving van? Should she scream? Should she confront him? Before she could form a coherent plan, Lawrence drove the van deep enough into the woods that they were completely invisible to anyone on the main highway. He brought the vehicle to a final stop, turned off the engine, and stepped out into the quiet forest. The moment Lawrence opened his door and stepped outside, Mary immediately opened the passenger door and scrambled out onto the dirt ground, desperate for fresh air and room to move. Keeping her head down, she immediately bent over and began reaching for her loose shoelaces, focused entirely on securing her footwear so she could prepare to run. But she never got the chance to finish. Before her fingers could tie the knot, a massive, crushing force struck her violently in the back of the head. The impact was so severe that it instantly short-circuited her nervous system, knocking her completely unconscious. Lawrence had not stepped out of the van to use the restroom. Before exiting, he had quietly reached down and grabbed a heavy hammer that he kept concealed right next to the driver's seat. He had silently walked around the front of the vehicle, crept up behind the unsuspecting 15-year-old girl, and smashed the heavy tool into her skull. When Mary finally regained consciousness, she found herself in total darkness. She was lying flat on her back on the hard metal floor in the rear cargo area of the light blue van. Her head was throbbing with excruciating, blinding pain, and she felt incredibly disoriented. As her vision slowly cleared, she looked out the rear windows of the van and realized that the vehicle was still parked in the exact same isolated spot deep within the forest. She instinctively tried to sit up and move her arms, but she immediately realized she was completely trapped. Lawrence had used heavy ropes and restraints to tie her hands and her feet securely to the interior structural frame of the van. She was pinned down, entirely immobile and completely at his mercy. Before she could fully process the horror of her restraint, she heard footsteps approaching the vehicle. Lawrence walked to the back of the van, swung the heavy rear doors wide open, and climbed into the cargo area. The polite, grandfatherly facade he had maintained on the highway was entirely gone. His face was cold, detached, and monstrous. Without saying a single word, he immediately launched a brutal, vicious, and prolonged physical and sexual assault against the bound teenager. Mary was absolutely terrified, a young child trapped in a living nightmare with a sadistic adult. She did not have the physical strength to fight back against her restraints, so she resorted to the only weapon she had left, her voice. As Lawrence assaulted her, Mary began to quietly, desperately beg for her life. Over and over again, through heavy tears, she whimpered, pleading with him to stop, promising him that if he just let her go, she would never tell a single soul what he had done to her. She promised to keep his secret forever if he would just show her a shred of mercy. Lawrence never responded to her pleas. He never spoke, he never yelled, and he never looked at her with remorse. He simply continued his horrific assault in absolute chilling silence for hours on end, ignoring her cries as the afternoon transitioned into the dark of night. Eventually, Lawrence grew physically exhausted. He finally stopped the assault, climbed out of the rear cargo area, and walked around to the front of the van. He climbed into the driver's seat, leaned his head back, and fell into a deep sleep. Back in the dark cargo hold, Mary lay in absolute agony. She spent the long night hours frantically pulling and twisting against the ropes, desperate to find some slack that would allow her to free her hands or feet. But Lawrence had tied the knots with expert, unyielding precision. The tight ropes only cut deeper into her skin, leaving her entirely unable to escape. She was left alone with her thoughts in the pitch black, weeping silently, wondering if she would ever see her family again, and fearing what this monster would do to her when he woke up. In the middle of the night, Lawrence suddenly awoke. Without uttering a word to the terrified girl in the back, he started the van's engine, shifted into gear, and drove out of the forest access road. He navigated back onto the main highway and drove through the darkness for a significant distance. Mary lay in the back, shifting violently with the movement of the van, completely unaware of where they were going. Eventually, Lawrence turned off the highway onto another remote access road, driving deep into an entirely different wilderness area. This time, he navigated the van down into the deep, rocky isolation of a massive desert canyon, far away from any potential witnesses or prying eyes. He brought the van to a final stop, walked around to the back, and opened the doors once again. Mary, battered and weeping, began her desperate begging all over again, crying out for freedom. But Lawrence remained entirely deaf to her suffering. He climbed back into the van, and the horrific torture and assault resumed, continuing unabated through the final hours of the night until the dark sky finally began to break and the morning sun rose over the canyon walls. When the sunlight finally illuminated the interior of the van, Lawrence stopped. He climbed out of the vehicle and stood on the dirt ground, staring in at his victim. He reached forward and, to Mary's immense shock, began to untie the heavy restraints that bound her limbs. He pulled her battered, bloodied body out of the cargo hold and forced her to stand upright on her feet. Mary was entirely weak, her body covered in deep bruises and blood, her spirit nearly broken. Believing that this might be the moment of her release, she looked at him with tears in her eyes and whispered a final plea, asking him to please just let her go home. Lawrence looked at her with a cruel, mocking expression. He repeated her words back to her, stating that since she wanted to be set free so badly, he was going to set her free. He walked away from her toward the front of the van, reached into a heavy metal toolbox, and pulled out a sharp, heavy-duty hatchet. Mary had only a fraction of a second to realize what was happening before Lawrence closed the distance between them. In one fluid, terrifying motion, he used his left hand to firmly grab Mary's left wrist, anchoring her arm in place. With his right hand, he raised the heavy hatchet high into the air and brought it down with massive force onto her left forearm. The sharp blade sliced cleanly through her flesh, muscle, and bone, completely severing her left arm off her body just below the elbow joint. The sheer shock and physical trauma caused Mary to fall backward onto the hard dirt ground. She stared down in absolute horror at the gaping, spurting wound where her left arm had been just moments before. Her brain struggled to process the unimaginable agony. But before she could even scream, Lawrence stepped over her. He reached down with his left hand, grabbed her right wrist, and pinned it down. Mary knew with absolute certainty what was coming next. Terrified and fighting for her life, she began to scream at the top of her lungs, kicking her legs out violently, striking Lawrence's body with all the remaining strength she possessed in a desperate bid to force him off her. But Lawrence's grip on her right wrist was unyielding. He raised the hatchet again and began hacking at her right forearm. It took 4 separate, brutal, agonizing blows of the hatchet to finally cut through the bone and completely sever her right arm from her body. Mary collapsed into a crumpled heap on the ground, bleeding profusely from both of her severed limbs, her body experiencing a level of physical pain that few human beings have ever survived. As she lay there screaming, Lawrence did not look at her face. Instead, his attention was completely caught by something bizarre and horrific. When he had severed Mary's left arm, her hand had instinctively clutched onto the sleeve of his shirt in a final death grip. Now, her severed left hand was still firmly attached to his clothing. With an air of absolute indifference and nonchalance, Lawrence stood over her, completely ignoring her screams, and began casually flicking his arm, trying to shake the severed hand off his sleeve. After a few moments, the hand finally detached and fell to the earth. Lawrence turned his attention back to Mary and noticed that she had suddenly gone entirely silent. Her body had gone completely limp, and she was lying motionless in a massive, expanding pool of her own blood. Believing that she had finally succumbed to blood loss and shock, Lawrence calmly walked back to his van, placed the bloody hatchet inside his toolbox, and walked back over to her seemingly lifeless body. He grabbed Mary by her shoulders and began dragging her body across the dirt ground, leaving a thick trail of blood in his wake. About 100 feet down the remote canyon road, the path ran directly over a massive concrete culvert, a giant drainage tunnel built deep underneath the roadway to allow water and heavy storm runoff to pass safely beneath the concrete without washing the road away. This particular culvert was constructed roughly 30 feet below the actual surface of the road. If a person stood on the edge of the road, there was a steep, near-vertical 30-foot drop-off down onto a bed of jagged rocks and boulders that surrounded the opening of the drainage tunnel. Lawrence dragged Mary's limp body directly to the edge of this precipice. Without a single hint of hesitation, he threw her body over the side, sending her plunging 30 feet down through the air to smash violently against the jagged rocks below. Lawrence then carefully navigated his way down the steep dirt embankment to the bottom of the canyon. He walked over to her crumpled body, picked her up, and stuffed her deep inside the dark, cold concrete interior of the culvert drainage pipe, hiding her from view. As he turned his back to walk away and leave her to die alone in the wilderness, he looked into the tunnel and uttered a final, chilling sentence. "Now you're free." But miracles do happen, and Mary Vincent was not dead. Legally, medically, and physically, she should have died at multiple different points during this horrific sequence of events. She should have died from the initial hammer blow, the massive blood loss from 2 severed limbs, the shock of the amputations, or the severe internal trauma of being thrown down a 30-foot cliff onto solid rock. But against all mathematical and medical odds, her heart kept beating. Later in her life, Mary would recount the terrifying reality that she was completely lucid, fully conscious, and profoundly aware of everything that happened to her during the entire attack, except for the brief moment she was knocked out by the hammer. She vividly remembered the sensation of her arms being severed. She recalled that when Lawrence first grabbed her left wrist, she had instinctively clamped her fingers down onto his shirt sleeve, trying to anchor herself. When the hatchet came down and severed her arm, she remembered falling backward, but her brain experienced a strange phenomenon where time seemed to slow down to an absolute crawl. As she fell through the air, she looked up and literally saw her own severed hand still firmly gripping the sleeve of Lawrence's shirt, detached from her body. When Lawrence began hacking at her right arm, Mary realized that if she continued to scream, kick, and fight, he would realize she was still alive and would likely use the hatchet to cut her throat or smash her skull. In a moment of supreme instinctual genius, she forced her entire body to go completely limp. She kept her eyes half open, maintaining a blank, glazed stare, and completely stopped breathing out loud. She watched through her eyelashes as Lawrence casually flicked her severed hand off his arm. She remained absolutely still and silent as he dragged her across the dirt, and she did not make a single sound or whimper when he threw her body off the 30-foot drop-off. The fall broke 4 of her ribs and caused immense internal agony, but her fierce will to survive told her that she had to endure the punishment in absolute silence, or he would finish her off. She lay perfectly still inside the dark concrete culvert, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading away, followed by the distant sound of his van engine starting up and driving off into the distance. Even after the van left, Mary did not immediately move. She worried that Lawrence might have parked his van further up the road and could be waiting at the top of the cliff, watching to see if she would crawl out. She forced herself to lie in a contorted, agonizing position inside the cold pipe for a long time. Eventually, the extreme blood loss began to take its toll, and an overwhelming, heavy wave of fatigue washed over her. She felt herself slipping toward unconsciousness, but she suddenly heard a distinct, powerful voice echoing inside her own mind. The voice told her with absolute clarity, "You cannot go to sleep. If you go to sleep right now, you are going to die. And if you die, this monster will get away with what he did, and he will do this to someone else." This thought triggered a massive, life-saving surge of adrenaline through her system. Mary made a definitive decision. She was going to live, and she was going to bring her attacker to justice. She slowly dragged her broken body out of the dark culvert. Once she was out on the canyon floor, she looked at the raw, bleeding nubs of her forearms. Knowing that she was rapidly bleeding to death, she dug the exposed bones and flesh of her arms directly into the dirt and mud, manually packing the open wounds with soil to create a crude, natural tourniquet to stop the bleeding. Then she realized that if she walked with her arms down, the gravity would cause her remaining blood and muscle tissue to slip out of the wounds. She raised her mutilated forearms high above her head and began the impossible task of climbing up the steep 30-foot embankment. Using her feet, her knees, and her broken ribs, she crawled and scratched her way up the dirt cliff until she finally reached the edge of the road. She was completely naked, covered from head to toe in thick mud, dirt, and her own blood, looking like a figure from a horror movie. She began to run down the highway, desperate for help. A car soon approached, but the driver was so utterly terrified by the sight of a blood-soaked, armless figure running down the road in the middle of nowhere that they panicked, stepped on the gas, and drove right past her. Refusing to give up, Mary kept running. She ran for 3 agonizing miles down the hot highway under the morning sun until she finally managed to flag down another vehicle. This car was occupied by a young couple. Though they were initially struck with absolute horror and shock by Mary's appearance, they quickly realized she was a victim in desperate need of help. They lifted her into their vehicle and sped down the highway toward the nearest hospital. Mary Vincent spent the next full month in the hospital undergoing intensive surgeries to save her life, treat her broken ribs, and clean her infected arm wounds. Throughout her grueling physical recovery, her mind remained sharp. She met with police detectives and provided them with an incredibly precise, highly detailed description of Lawrence Singleton, his physical features, his age, and the exact appearance of his light blue passenger van. Using her stellar memory, forensic artists created a highly accurate composite sketch of the attacker, which was immediately broadcast across television news and printed in local newspapers. Not long after the sketch was released, one of Lawrence Singleton's neighbors recognized the drawing and the description of the van. The neighbor contacted the police, leading to Singleton's immediate arrest. He was brought to trial, where Mary Vincent bravely took the witness stand, looked her attacker in the eye, and testified in detail about the horrors he had inflicted upon her. Singleton was found guilty of multiple counts, including kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder. However, due to the specific laws of California in 1978, the maximum sentence the judge could legally hand down for these crimes was a mere 14 years in prison. The judge expressed immense frustration, stating on the record that he wished he could lock Singleton away for life, but his hands were legally tied by the statute. As Mary was leaving the courthouse following the sentencing, she had to walk directly past Singleton. He leaned in close to the young girl, lowered his voice, and whispered a terrifying promise. "I will finish the job if it takes me the rest of my life." Because of automatic prison credits for good behavior and his work as a teacher's assistant behind bars, Lawrence Singleton was paroled in 1986, having served just 8 years of his 14-year sentence. His release sparked massive public outrage and protests across California. Mary, who had since grown up, gotten married, and given birth to 2 sons, was absolutely paralyzed with fear. She spent years looking over her shoulder, terrified that her stalker would fulfill his vow to finish the job and murder her and her children. But Singleton did not go after Mary. Instead, he relocated to Florida, where his violent, predatory nature inevitably resurfaced. In 1997, nearly 20 years after his attack on Mary, Singleton brutally attacked and murdered a 31-year-old mother of three named Roxanne Hayes in his home. He stabbed her multiple times, ending her life. At his murder trial in Florida, Mary Vincent bravely traveled to the courtroom to testify against him once again, providing the jury with first-hand evidence of his history of extreme sadistic violence. Her powerful testimony was instrumental in helping the prosecution secure a definitive death sentence for Singleton. However, before the state of Florida could execute him, Lawrence Singleton died of cancer in a prison hospital room in the year 2001. When Mary received the news of his death, she admitted to feeling deeply cheated that he had died of natural causes rather than facing the executioner. However, her sons expressed immense relief that the monster who had haunted their mother's life was finally gone forever, and Mary took great solace in knowing he could never hurt another soul. The widespread public fury over Singleton's early release in California, combined with the tragic preventable death of Roxanne Hayes, led directly to a major overhaul of the American legal system. Lawmakers drafted and passed a landmark piece of legislation known as the Lawrence Singleton Bill. This law fundamentally changed sentencing guidelines for violent crimes, giving judges the explicit legal authority to hand down sentences of 25 years to life for any criminal acts that involved explicit torture, aggravated mayhem, or the intentional mutilation of a victim's body. Under the rules of this bill, if Lawrence Singleton had committed his horrific crimes against Mary Vincent today, he would never have been granted parole, he would never have walked free, and Roxanne Hayes would still be alive. Mary Vincent refused to let her trauma define the rest of her existence. She went on to become a highly accomplished artist and an outspoken advocate for victims of violent crime. Using custom-designed prosthetic arms that she learned to master with incredible dexterity, she reclaimed her life, her independence, and her joy, standing as a permanent symbol of the unbreakable power of the human spirit. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. This story is about a grandfather named Chris Watson who lived a comfortable life. Chris spent decades building his career, starting out in social work, helping the homeless, before transitioning into the lucrative travel and tourism industry. He divided his time between his quiet hometown and Saigon, Vietnam, where he had established a successful network of travel companies. Chris was a man of routines, but he also had a taste for the finer things. He drove a beautiful high-end Ford Raptor truck, and he was almost always carrying his signature Louis Vuitton bag. To his family, Chris was a doting grandfather who wanted to ensure his children and grandchildren were set up for the future. Through smart investments, Chris had managed to amass a fortune of around $3 million. He felt like he could finally sit back and enjoy his retirement. But unfortunately, his success also drew the attention of someone with a dark, greedy plan. It all began on what was supposed to be a peaceful vacation. Chris had been working hard and felt like he needed a break. Before leaving, he made sure to get a routine checkup at his dentist's office, and he had even taken care of his health by getting vaccinated with Gardasil, as he wanted to ensure he was in peak physical shape. He was an active, older man who loved outdoor activities, especially cycling with local clubs. As he boarded his flight and began his holiday, Chris decided to completely unplug. He turned down his screen brightness, put his phone on silent, and prepared to enjoy some quiet time away from work. But shortly after arriving at his vacation spot, his dream holiday quickly turned into a living nightmare. It started very subtly. Chris was relaxing in his rental home when he began to feel a slight discomfort in his stomach. At first, he brushed it off as a simple case of food poisoning or jet lag from his travels. He decided to drink some water and try to sleep it off. But as the hours went by, his condition grew dramatically worse. He was hit with violent waves of nausea and started vomiting uncontrollably. Along with the stomach pain, a blinding, crushing headache began to set in. But the most terrifying symptom was the sudden failure of his vision. Chris realized he could barely see. The room was spinning and everything looked incredibly dark and blurry, even when he turned the lights up. His family, realizing this was far more serious than a simple stomach bug, rushed him to the nearest hospital. When Chris arrived at the emergency room, the medical staff was completely baffled. His organs were rapidly shutting down, and his blood chemistry was severely abnormal. The doctors tried everything they could to stabilize him. Because Chris had recently visited his dentist and taken some routine medications, the doctors initially wondered if he was experiencing an extremely rare, delayed allergic reaction to an anesthetic. They ran standard toxicology screens and treated him for severe metabolic distress, but nothing they did seemed to work. Within a matter of hours, Chris Watson passed away. The sudden, agonizing death of this vibrant, healthy grandfather left his family in an absolute state of shock and grief. They could not understand how a man who had been in such great shape just days before could suddenly deteriorate and die so quickly. In the immediate aftermath, the local authorities and medical staff believed that Chris's death was the result of a tragic accident or a natural medical emergency. The initial theory was that he had suffered a stroke or accidental food poisoning. It seemed like a tragic, heartbreaking end to a wonderful life, and the police were prepared to close the case as a death by natural causes. But then, a massive financial red flag went up that changed the entire direction of the case. Only a few days after Chris passed away, a claim was filed to access his estate and his $3 million life insurance policy. The family expected that Chris's hard-earned wealth would be distributed to his children and grandchildren, but they were stunned to find that the primary beneficiary on his accounts had been changed very recently, right before his death. The person claiming the $3 million was not his children or his grandchildren. It was a woman whom the family had barely even heard of. She claimed to be a close associate of Chris, but her sudden appearance and her immediate attempt to claim his entire fortune made the family incredibly suspicious. They immediately went to the police and demanded a full investigation. The detectives assigned to the case realized that something was seriously wrong. They began by reconstructing Chris's final days, trying to figure out exactly who he had been spending time with before he fell ill. They obtained security camera footage from several locations that Chris had visited during his vacation. As they reviewed the footage, they found something incredibly suspicious. They looked at cameras from a popular high-end shopping district called Marina Square, where Chris had spent an afternoon. In the footage, Chris could be seen walking through the open-air mall carrying his luxury Louis Vuitton bag. But he was not alone. Walking just a few paces behind him was a woman wearing a very distinctive, bright purple dress. Later in the footage, the detectives saw Chris and the woman in the purple dress sitting together at an outdoor cafe. They were engaged in a friendly conversation. At one point, the woman stood up, walked over to the counter, and ordered 2 drinks. She returned to the table and handed Chris a cup of matcha tea. The cameras captured Chris taking several large sips of the drink while the woman watched him intently. It turns out this suspect had a very cunning way of gathering information. She had visited the very same dentist's office where Chris was a patient. By pretending to be a family member or simply by exploiting a moment of distraction when the receptionist stepped away from the front desk, she managed to catch a glimpse of Chris's patient file. This file contained sensitive personal information, including his full name, date of birth, home address, and financial details. This was the key she needed to begin her fraudulent scheme. She was a woman who was drowning in debt, living far beyond her means, and she desperately wanted to maintain a high society lifestyle without actually working for it. With this new lead, the detectives knew they had to halt any plans for Chris's burial and order a comprehensive forensic autopsy, specifically requesting an advanced toxicological analysis. When the lab results finally came back, they completely shattered the initial theory of an accidental death. The medical examiner discovered that Chris's body contained highly lethal levels of methanol mixed with a stabilizing compound known as methyl cellulose. Methanol is an incredibly dangerous chemical. It is a highly toxic form of alcohol that is commonly found in industrial solvents, windshield wiper fluid, and even high-end nail polishes, which are sometimes imported as German polish. It is a silent and deadly poison because when it is ingested, the body metabolizes it into formaldehyde and then into formic acid. This acid directly attacks the optic nerves, which explains why Chris experienced such sudden and terrifying vision loss before his vital organs shut down. The presence of methyl cellulose was also a critical detail, as it is a chemical thickener. The killer had likely used it to keep the methanol suspended in the drink and to alter the texture, making it harder for Chris to notice that his matcha tea had been laced with a deadly chemical. The detectives now knew they were dealing with a premeditated murder. They went back to the rental home and searched the trash bins, eventually finding the discarded paper cup from the matcha tea that Chris had been drinking on the day he fell ill. The forensic laboratory tested the residue inside the cup, and the results confirmed their suspicions. The cup was heavily contaminated with traces of methanol and methyl cellulose. The focus of the investigation shifted entirely to the mysterious woman in the purple dress. The police identified her and obtained a search warrant for her home and all of her personal electronic devices, including her Apple computer. The digital forensics team took her Apple computer and began a deep dive into the hard disk. What they found on that hard drive was absolutely devastating. The suspect had not been careful. Her search history was filled with incredibly incriminating queries. Over the weeks leading up to Chris's death, she had searched for phrases like how to buy pure methanol online, what is the lethal dose of methanol for an older man, how long does it take for methanol to kill someone, and can an autopsy detect methyl cellulose? She had also spent hours researching how to make a chemical poisoning look like a natural heart attack or stroke. The digital forensics unit had to use advanced data recovery software to search the hard disk of her Apple computer. The suspect thought she was clever because she had deleted her search history and emptied her trash bin before the police arrived. But she did not realize that when you delete a file on a computer, the data remains on the hard drive until it is overwritten by new information. The forensic experts were able to recover every single deleted file, including her web searches, her online purchase receipts for the industrial methanol, and the drafts of the forged beneficiary forms. They even found a digital log showing the exact dates and times she had accessed Chris's financial accounts to change his beneficiary information. With all of this evidence, the detectives were able to reconstruct exactly how this horrific crime had taken place. The woman in the purple dress had met Chris through his travel business and immediately saw him as an opportunity to secure a life of luxury. She spent months befriending him, gaining his trust, and learning his daily routines. She found out about his $3 million net worth and decided that she wanted it all for herself. She carefully planned the murder, purchasing the industrial methanol and methyl cellulose online. She knew that Chris loved matcha tea, which has a very strong earthy flavor and a naturally thick texture. She realized that this would be the perfect vehicle for the poison, as the strong taste of the matcha would easily mask the harsh chemical burn of the methanol, and the natural thickness would disguise the addition of the methyl cellulose. On the day of the murder, she wore her eye-catching purple dress and met Chris at Marina Square. She acted like a caring friend, buying him his favorite matcha tea and secretly slipping the pre-measured lethal dose of poison into his cup. She watched him drink it, knowing that she had just signed his death warrant. She then escorted him back to his rental, where she left him to die a slow, agonizing death. She believed that because methanol poisoning mimics the symptoms of other medical emergencies, the doctors would write it off as a natural death, especially given Chris's age. She figured the body would be quickly cremated or buried, and she would be free to claim the $3 million and live a life of luxury, perhaps buying her own high-end vehicles like a Ford Raptor or traveling the world. But her greed and overconfidence led to her downfall. She did not realize that the security cameras at Marina Square had captured her every move, and she did not expect the detectives to thoroughly analyze her Apple computer's hard disk. During the highly publicized trial, the prosecutors presented the security camera footage from Marina Square and the deleted digital evidence recovered from the hard disk of her Apple computer. The defense team tried to claim that Chris had accidentally consumed the methanol from a household product like German polish, but the exact chemical trace found in his body matched the precise recipe on the suspect's hard drive. The jury quickly found her guilty of first-degree murder, financial fraud, and forgery, and the judge sentenced her to life in prison without parole. While justice was eventually served, the emotional pain remained for Chris's grieving family. The $3 million estate was returned to his heirs, but his empty Ford Raptor truck and his signature Louis Vuitton bag sat as silent reminders of a vibrant life cut tragically short by sheer greed. They are left with the haunting lesson that sometimes the most dangerous people stand closest to us, wearing a friendly smile and offering a warm drink. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Sometimes the most frightening stories are not the ones about monsters hiding in the dark or shadowy figures in the woods. They are the stories that start in the most ordinary of places. A radio station, a military ship, a county jail. They involve regular people making what seem like small decisions, but those decisions create ripples that spiral into something truly unbelievable and often tragic. Today we're looking at 3 stories where a simple choice, a fun contest, and a routine arrest went horribly wrong. One is a story of incredible laziness, another of a game that turned deadly, and the last is a story of a man being completely forgotten by the world. To do this first story justice, it has to be told in the first person. So just know, for this part, I am simply an actor relaying someone else's experience. I was on a U.S. military ship sitting in the wardroom. The wardroom is basically the officer's lounge, a place to grab a coffee or a bite to eat. It was early morning, and the operations officer came stumbling in. This guy was the absolute definition of not a morning person. He was bleary-eyed, moving like a zombie, and clutching a bagel in his hand. He sits down at the table directly across from me, barely conscious, and starts gnawing on his breakfast. I was sitting with my back to the outboard side of the ship, which is the outside wall. Right next to my head was a porthole, and the morning sun was beaming through it. The light cut right across the room and was hitting this officer directly in his face. He's squinting, trying to block the sun with his hand, looking totally miserable. I'm just watching him, expecting him to do the logical thing and just shift his chair a few inches to the left or right to get out of the sun's path. But he doesn't. Instead, this officer slowly, and I mean slowly, reaches for the phone that was mounted on the wall. He picks up the receiver, brings it to his ear, and in a groggy voice he says, "Yeah, bridge!" Yeah, this is ops. "I need you to adjust our path." He pauses for a second. "Yeah, 156. Yep, that's about right." "Okay. All right, bye." He hangs up the phone and just sits there. He hasn't moved an inch. He's still squinting, looking up at the sunlight that's blazing on his face. I'm looking back and forth between him and the porthole, trying to figure out what just happened. And then, I see it. The circle of light from the porthole gradually begins to shift off of him. It moves across the table, onto the wall behind him, and then it just stops. By ordering the bridge to change the ship's course by about 15 degrees, he had changed the ship's position just enough to move the sun off his face. He literally redirected thousands of tons of steel and a crew of hundreds of people just because he was too lazy to move his chair. I was in total awe. I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. For a second, I worried that the sheer, unbelievable brilliance of this move was lost on him in his tired state. But then, as I'm just staring at him, he takes a bite of his bagel, looks up at me, and gives me a little smile before going right back to his breakfast. In November of 2006, Nintendo released a brand new gaming console. It was called the Wii, and it was an absolute sensation. It was so popular that it sold out almost completely right away. By January of the next year, you still couldn't find one on the shelves in most places around the world. People were going crazy, spending unbelievable amounts of money online just to get their hands on one. A radio station in Sacramento, California called KDND managed to get a hold of one of these coveted systems. They decided they would give it away as a prize in an on-air contest. The contest had a catchy, if a bit silly, name. It was called Hold Your Wii for a Wii. The premise was simple. Contestants would be given lots and lots of water to drink. The person who could hold it the longest, meaning they didn't go to the bathroom to urinate, would win the brand new Nintendo Wii. In the days leading up to the contest, the radio station promoted it very aggressively on the air. As they did, lots of concerned listeners started calling in. They warned the station that drinking too much water too quickly can actually be deadly, but the station just brushed these concerns off. The on-air personalities said they were aware of the risks and that all the contestants would be signing a waiver. This waiver, they claimed, meant the station was not responsible for whatever happened to them. On the morning of Friday, January 12th, 18 contestants showed up at the KDND radio station. They were all led into a room and handed their waivers to sign. One contestant later said the waiver only seemed to cover publicity issues, not anything about health and safety. One of the people there that day was a 28-year-old woman named Jennifer Strange. Jennifer was a mother of 3, and she was there trying to win this Wii for her kids. She, along with everyone else, signed the paper and was then ushered into the contest room. The rules were laid out. They were each handed an 8-ounce bottle of water. Every 15 minutes, they were expected to finish that water bottle. If they couldn't finish it in time, or if they got up to use the bathroom at any point, they were out of the contest. The contest officially started at 6:45 a.m. By 8 a.m., after 5 bottles of water had been consumed, a number of contestants had already pulled themselves out of the game to use the bathroom. The radio staff, however, felt like the contest was moving too slowly. So, to speed things up, they gave the remaining contestants, including Jennifer, a larger bottle of water to drink from. Over the next several hours, all of the contestants, except for Jennifer and one other person, had dropped out. The pain was just too much. They had to go to the bathroom. Jennifer was heard on the air, her voice strained, saying that it hurt so much. One of the radio hosts just laughed and said, "Well, do you need to lay down?" Then someone else piped up and said, "She can't even walk." And the room just filled with laughter, and nobody did anything. Around this time, a nurse who was listening to the broadcast called into the station. She very emphatically told them that what they were doing was a really, really bad idea. She said, "You're going to get someone killed from water intoxication." Water intoxication, also known as water poisoning, is a very real and dangerous condition. In a nutshell, when you drink way too much water in a short period of time, it dilutes the sodium levels in your bloodstream. This can cause your cells, including your brain cells, to swell up. This swelling can lead to comas, seizures, and even death. The host, after hearing this nurse's very serious concern, just turned away from the phone and yelled to the contestants, "Hey, is anybody dying out there?" Then he just laughed and hung up on the nurse. A little while later, you can hear one of the hosts on the broadcast commenting on how Jennifer's belly looked really strange. It had become totally distended and bloated. They joked that it looked like she was pregnant. At some point, both Jennifer and the other remaining contestant started vomiting. But instead of dropping out of the contest, they just continued to drink more water, determined not to go to the bathroom. But finally, the pain became too much for Jennifer to bear. She dropped out of the contest, and she finally relieved herself. For coming in second place, she was given tickets to a Justin Timberlake concert. On her drive home from the radio station, Jennifer began experiencing a horrific headache. It was so bad that she was just sobbing uncontrollably. Through her tears, she called one of her coworkers and told her she wasn't going to be able to make it into work that day. Her head just hurt too much. After she hung up, the coworker she had just spoken to was really concerned about her. She decided to call Jennifer's mother to let her know what was going on. About an hour later, Jennifer's mother headed over to Jennifer's house to check on her. When she got there, she found Jennifer dead in her bathroom. She had died from water poisoning. The station was ultimately sued by Jennifer's family. A jury found the station was negligent, and they were ordered to pay over $16 million in damages. In 2005, a 57-year-old man named Stephen Slevin was physically a healthy man, but mentally he was really struggling. He was depressed and felt like his life didn't have any purpose anymore. So, in August of that year, he decided to just get in his car and go on a road trip. He didn't have a destination. He just felt like if he could get out on the open road and just go somewhere, anywhere, he might start to feel better. On this road trip, he eventually began drinking alcohol. Before long, he was swerving along a New Mexico highway. A police officer saw his erratic driving and pulled him over. Once Stephen failed his sobriety test, the police officer arrested him for a DWI. Stephen was brought to a local detention center. During his booking process, it was discovered that he had a history of mental illness. So the officers, following that county's policy, decided to segregate him from the rest of the general population. In an effort to protect Stephen from himself, they moved him into a padded cell on the first floor. They removed all of his clothing and put him in what's called a suicide smock. It looks kind of like a big, thick blanket that's wrapped around your upper body. It keeps inmates warm and modest, but it also prevents them from being able to ball up their clothes to create a noose they could hurt themselves with. After a few days in this padded cell, Stephen was moved to a better cell. This one had a window, a shower, and a toilet. He was kept there for 2 weeks under strict medical observation. But at the end of those 2 weeks, for reasons that are still not entirely clear, Stephen, this mentally unstable man, was moved into solitary confinement to await his trial for the DWI. Solitary confinement is a type of imprisonment where an inmate is put into a single-person cell and they are kept there nearly around the clock, without any significant human interaction. The psychological effects of solitary confinement are well documented and they are terrifying. Just 15 days in solitary can be enough to cause permanent psychological damage. Stephen's first few weeks in solitary were actually okay. He was allowed to write to his family, and he was able to detox and reflect on his life. During those first few weeks, it was noted in the records that Stephen was very polite in his very limited interactions with the officers who were dropping food off through the slot in his door. Also, when Stephen had a few minor medical issues, instead of throwing a fit, he would just knock on the inside of his door and wait patiently for someone to acknowledge him. This often took a long time, but he never got frustrated or angry. But by January of 2006, so roughly 3 months into his solitary stint, Stephen had not received any updates on when his case was going to go to trial. And he was starting to lose his grip on reality. He was having these severe panic attacks, and he was suffering from intense hallucinations. He desperately wanted to find out how much longer he was going to be kept in that cell, but nobody would tell him anything. He tried writing letters to his family, asking them for help, or asking them to try to get an update on his case. But when he went to actually write the letters, his hands would shake so severely from the stress and anxiety that he literally could not write. Starting that January, Stephen began spending the bulk of his day huddled in the corner of his cell with his knees tucked up to his chest, just rocking back and forth. He was supposed to be allowed out of his cell a few times a month, but in April of that year, that stopped. He almost never left his cell again. And without ever leaving his cell, Stephen was unable to bathe. His skin began to develop a fungus and started to fall off in patches. His fingernails grew long and curled. His teeth began to rot. Finally, on the 8th of May 2007, after 1 year and 8 months of being in solitary confinement, Stephen was transferred out of his cell to a behavioral institute in Las Vegas, Nevada. After bathing and shaving and getting his hair cut and receiving proper medical treatment, he was back to his normal self within a couple of days. While he was there, he had a chance to speak to a lawyer. The lawyer would later say that during their entire meeting, Stephen just kept asking, "Where have I been?" The lawyer explained to him, "You've been in solitary confinement, awaiting trial. You've been there for almost 2 years." Stephen was shocked. He literally didn't believe him. He actually couldn't remember that huge chunk of his life. It was as if his mind, to protect itself, had completely repressed the trauma. But as the lawyer told him more about it, it began to come back to him in flashes. He begged the lawyer to not let them send him back to that solitary confinement cell. The lawyer said, "Unfortunately, if that's where they decide to keep you, that's where you'll be until you have your trial. And we have no idea when that trial is going to be. But stay strong. It's bound to be soon." Stephen stayed at the Institute for 2 weeks. During that time, he asked constantly about when his trial was going to happen, but nobody knew. And at the end of those 2 weeks, Stephen was abruptly taken from his room, put in a van, driven back to New Mexico, and put right back into his solitary confinement cell. Immediately, Stephen began to deteriorate again. He begged the guards not to put him back in there, but nobody was listening. And before long, the heavy steel door had shut, and he was all alone again. Within a couple of days, Stephen developed a painful abscess in one of his teeth. He tried to get medical attention, but he was ignored. So he sat in the corner of his cell, and for 8 straight hours one day, he rocked back and forth and violently twisted and yanked and pulled on that infected tooth until he was able to rip it out of his own head. Almost 2 months later, on the 22nd of June 2007, Stephen's case was finally put before a judge. The judge immediately dismissed all of the charges against him. It's believed the judge had found out about the horrible mistreatment Stephen had endured and took pity on him, but we will never know for sure. 3 days later, Stephen was released from jail and reunited with his family. He had been in solitary confinement for 2 years without so much as a single hearing to tell him what was going on with his case. He had essentially been completely forgotten about. He would go on to sue the county, and he won $15.5 million in damages. However, at the same time he was winning this case, he was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer and given less than a year to live. It is unclear if he is still alive today. 3 completely different stories, but they all show how fragile our own worlds can be. How a moment of extreme laziness, a terrible lapse in judgment during a contest, or a crack in the system that's supposed to protect us can change everything forever. It's a haunting reminder that sometimes the real horror isn't some external force, but the devastating consequences of very human decisions. 3 stories. 3 ordinary places. 3 decisions that never should have mattered until they did. Because what makes these stories unsettling isn't just what happened, it's how easily it all began. A small choice. A moment of carelessness. A system that didn't react in time. And suddenly, everything changed. Until next time. This is a story about a brilliant young man who had millions of dollars in the bank, but was so completely consumed by a single terrifying thought that he ended up building a literal maze of death right beneath his own home. And because of his actions, a young 19-year-old man who trusted him with his life would find himself trapped in a pitch-black nightmare with absolutely no way out. To understand how this tragedy happened, we have to go back to the beginning of the story of Daniel Beckwith. Daniel was born in 1,991 inches, Bethesda, Maryland, which is a very quiet and wealthy suburb just outside of Washington, D.C. Daniel was the only child of two highly eccentric and incredibly intelligent parents named Linda and David. His father, David, had a doctoral degree and was a very accomplished opera singer who had actually performed at the White House. His mother, Linda, was a brilliant lawyer who had graduated from the prestigious Columbia Law School and had worked as a high-level government attorney. But Linda eventually decided that the legal profession was far too corrupt for her liking, so she gave it all up to become an opera singer just like her husband. When Daniel was just a toddler, his parents realized that he was not like other children. He taught himself how to read before he was even 3 years old. He had an incredibly high intellect, and his mother became fiercely protective of him. She decided that the public school system was simply not advanced enough to teach her brilliant son, so she chose to homeschool him. By the time Daniel was 5 years old, he was reading thick classic novels, and shortly after that, he figured out how to completely dismantle and reprogram his video game systems. But despite his massive intelligence, Daniel had a very lonely and isolated childhood. He was almost never allowed to go outside and play with the other children in the neighborhood. On the rare occasions that he was permitted to step outside, his parents would hover over him the entire time, watching his every move. And almost nobody from the neighborhood was ever allowed to come inside the Beckwith house. This was because Daniel's parents were severe hoarders. If you stepped through the front door of that house, you would immediately run into towering stacks of old papers, books, rotting cardboard boxes, and discarded food containers. Then, in the year 2000, when Daniel was 9 years old, his father was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. This meant his mother had to take care of both her ailing husband and her young son, and under the immense stress, her eccentric behavior grew much worse. She became completely obsessed with protecting their property. If a neighbor walked even slightly too close to her lawn, Linda would run out of the front door and scream at them until they ran away. But despite how strange they were, anyone who knew the Beckwith family could tell that Linda and David absolutely adored their son. They just could not give him any personal space. One neighbor recalled seeing the family out trick-or-treating for Halloween, and even though Daniel was a teenager by then, all three of them were wearing matching giant hamster outfits. Daniel loved his parents, but as he grew older, he realized how smothering they really were. He wanted to connect with people his own age, so he turned to the internet. He found a community on an anonymous online forum called 4chan. On this forum, Daniel could pretend to be whoever he wanted. He created a tough guy persona, bragging to other users about how he had finished high school by age 15 and spent his free time building explosives in his backyard. But occasionally, Daniel would let his guard down and talk about a deep, paralyzing fear that occupied his thoughts at all times. This was his extreme fear of death. In 2010, it looked like Daniel's isolation might finally end. He enrolled at the University of Illinois to study computer science and electrical engineering. His parents dropped him off at the train station, and as the train pulled away, Daniel felt a massive wave of relief. He felt like he was finally free. But just a few months into his first semester, he received terrible news. His mother had been diagnosed with cancer. She had hidden her illness from everyone, including Daniel, and had refused to see a doctor. By the time Daniel rushed back home, she was in terrible shape, and she passed away just 2 weeks later. Only 3 people showed up to her funeral. Daniel stood there in mismatched clothes and pants that were far too short, looking completely dazed as he gave her eulogy, telling the small crowd that he felt totally lost. After he went back to college, his father's health began to decline rapidly, and Daniel had to place him into an assisted living facility. Living alone in his college apartment, Daniel was completely consumed by grief and a massive escalation of his fear of death. He had seen his mother die suddenly, and now he was watching his father slowly wither away. He went back onto the online forums and talked about taking a defensive position against his own mortality. To do this, Daniel researched the most common causes of death for young men his age. When he saw that car accidents were a leading cause, he went out and reinforced all the doors of his car with heavy Kevlar plates, and whenever he drove the car, he wore a thick, bulletproof Kevlar vest because he believed it would protect his internal organs from blunt force trauma in a crash. He also knew that cancer was a major killer, so he personally went to a doctor and demanded that every single mole on his body be surgically removed as a preventative measure. But the thing that Daniel feared most was not a car accident or a disease. He became absolutely convinced that a nuclear attack on the United States was imminent. He believed the only way to survive was to build a proper underground fallout shelter. Fortunately for him, his mother had left him a multi-million-dollar trust fund, so he had the money to do whatever he wanted. He put his college studies on hold, returned to his childhood home in Bethesda, went down into the basement, and began to dig a massive hole right in the center of the concrete floor. Over the next 2 years, Daniel split his time between his college classes and his secret project in Bethesda. He hired various contractors to come to his home and dig a massive, sprawling labyrinth of tunnels deep beneath his property. But in 2012, both his schoolwork and his tunnel digging came to a sudden halt because of his own bizarre behavior. Professors at his university began to report that someone was sneaking into their offices at night, hacking into their computers, and sending highly inappropriate and embarrassing emails to their entire contact lists of students and faculty. After sending the emails, the hacker would use superglue to seal the professor's office doors shut so they could not get inside the next morning. The university police department investigated the strange vandalism for months. Eventually, several students pointed them toward Daniel, noting that he was a genius-level hacker who had recently spoken at a major cybersecurity conference. A detective went to Daniel's apartment to talk to him, but Daniel did not answer the door. As the detective was standing in the hallway, he noticed a package sitting on the welcome mat. It was addressed to a person named S. Loomis Detwiler. The detective suspected this might be an alias for Daniel, so he went back to the station and ran the name through their databases. It turned out that this alias was connected to an online profile that had recently been bragging about breaking into university offices and hacking the professors. With this information, the police secured a search warrant for Daniel's apartment. When officers entered the apartment using a spare key, they were met with a scene of absolute chaos. The apartment was packed with towering piles of papers, books, computer wires, trash, and old food boxes. A dirty mattress with no sheets sat right in the middle of the room. On top of a mini fridge in the corner, detectives found Daniel's laptop. It was open and unlocked. The officers cloned his hard drive right then and there, and the digital evidence they recovered proved beyond a doubt that Daniel was indeed the hacker. Daniel was arrested and charged with multiple serious felonies, but right before his trial, his lawyers managed to secure a plea deal. Daniel immediately went onto the website Reddit and bragged to online users that he fully expected the state governor to step in and pardon him because he had donated a large sum of money to the governor's campaign, but that pardon never came. Fortunately for Daniel, the judge gave him a very light sentence. He was ordered to pay $23,000 in restitution to the university and was placed on 2 years of probation. But Daniel was expelled from the university, so he moved back into his childhood home in Bethesda to live alone. With no school to worry about, he poured all of his energy into building his underground bunker. He hired specialized contractors to expand the tunnels, digging deep into the earth and branching out in multiple directions, eventually crossing well past his own property lines. To fund his ongoing project, Daniel turned his attention to trading Bitcoin. Because of his mathematical brilliance, he became incredibly good at day trading cryptocurrency, Within a short period of time, he made millions of dollars. By 2015, his probation had ended and his massive underground bunker was mostly complete. He spent less time trading and more time sitting inside his bunker, live streaming on a popular website called Blab. During these live streams, Daniel talked at length about his investment strategies and how he had accumulated his fortune. But he was deeply paranoid about anyone discovering his real identity or his location. Whenever he went live, he wore a large, heavy fire protection hood that completely covered his head and face, and he used a voice changer to mask his voice. He went by the online username 3-Alarm Lamp Scooter. Among his small but very loyal group of followers was a 19-year-old young man named Askia Kafra. Askia lived in a pleasant, middle-class neighborhood only 15 minutes away from Daniel's house, but he had no idea they were neighbors. Daniel always claimed that he lived in a secret underground bunker somewhere deep in the state of Virginia. Askia completely idolized this mysterious online millionaire. Askia was the son of hardworking immigrants from Trinidad, and he desperately wanted to be successful and wealthy. When Askia turned 18, he had received a $100,000 financial settlement from a childhood lead poisoning lawsuit. For a brief moment, he got a taste of what it was like to be rich. But he was young and naive, and he quickly blew through all of the money on expensive dinners, designer clothes, and renting high-end sports cars like Mercedes and BMWs. Once the money was completely gone, Askia was determined to get it all back. He came up with a business plan to build a new smartphone app called Equity Shark. The app was designed to be a crowdfunding platform that would allow average people to invest small amounts of money into promising new startup companies. Askia was convinced that this app was going to make him a billionaire. But he had no money left to actually build the app. He and his business partner applied for a $100,000 grant for young entrepreneurs who had dropped out of college, which Askia had recently done. Askia was highly confident they would get the grant, but he still had many of the blind spots of a young man learning how to navigate the adult world. His biggest weakness was that he was incredibly trusting, and he was quick to believe anyone who seemed successful. It was during this time that Askia found Daniel's live streams on Blab. He was amazed by this wealthy figure who called himself 3-Alarm Lamp Scooter. When Daniel mentioned to his viewers that he was looking to make some new business investments, Askia saw his chance. He reached out to Daniel and asked if he and his partner could pitch their app, Equity Shark, to him. Daniel agreed. In June of 2016, Askia and his partner went to a local hookah bar to meet this mysterious investor. They had no idea what he actually looked like because he always wore the fire protection hood online. But as soon as Daniel walked through the door of the bar, they knew it was him. Daniel was wearing an incredibly bulky, oversized shirt, and it was obvious to everyone in the room that he was wearing a heavy bulletproof vest underneath it. Askia and his partner simply overlooked this strange behavior, assuming it was just another one of the eccentricities of a tech genius. They sat down and pitched Equity Shark to Daniel. They explained that their success rested on securing the $100,000 grant, which they were absolutely certain they would receive. Daniel was highly impressed by their pitch, and he agreed to invest $5,000 of his own money into their company. But he made them sign an agreement stating that they had to pay him back using the grant money, and if they did not get the grant, they would have to find another way to repay him. Askia was thrilled. He felt that getting the grant was a sure thing, so there was absolutely no risk in taking Daniel's money. Shortly after securing the $5,000, the program manager for the grant called Askia and told him that his company had made it to the second round. They needed to fly out to San Francisco to pitch their idea in person. Askia and his partner were incredibly excited. They immediately called Daniel to tell him the good news, and then they booked their flights. But in their excitement and lack of travel experience, they made a massive mistake. They booked their flights to Los Angeles International Airport instead of San Francisco, which put them 400 miles south of where they needed to be. When they landed in Los Angeles and realized what they had done, they panicked. They tried to rent a car to drive north, but because they were under 25, no rental car company would give them a vehicle. In desperation, they realized they were old enough to rent a U-Haul moving truck. They rented a massive U-Haul and began speeding up the California highway, trying to make it to San Francisco in time for their meeting. But they made another critical error. They entered the wrong address into their GPS, which sent them miles in the wrong direction. By the time they finally arrived at the meeting location in San Francisco, they were hours late. The grant manager was extremely upset and told them to just go back home and wait for a phone call. Back in Maryland, Askia was deeply embarrassed. He confessed to Daniel that they had completely ruined the trip and that they likely would not receive the grant. Askia asked Daniel if he would be willing to invest even more money to help them salvage the app, but Daniel was clearly losing interest in Equity Shark and was hesitant to put any more of his fortune into it. Hoping to stay in Daniel's good graces and prove his worth, Askia offered to do some physical labor for him. He had heard Daniel mention on his live streams that he was looking to expand some of the underground tunnels in his bunker, and Askia offered to do the digging. Daniel was eager to hire him, but he told Askia that because the bunker was a highly classified and secret location, there would be very strict security rules. Daniel explained that he could not allow anyone to know the address of his home because of the imminent threat of a nuclear strike. Askia agreed to all of the rules. On the 28th of January 2017, just after 2 o'clock in the morning, Askia stood outside his house waiting to be picked up. Daniel arrived in a minivan, got out, and handed Askia a pair of heavily modified safety goggles that had been painted completely black so that Askia could not see anything. Daniel then put the goggles on Askia's head, guided him into the passenger seat, and began to drive. Daniel drove in continuous looping circles on the highway and back and forth through various neighborhoods. He wanted to make Askia believe they were traveling to a remote location far away in Virginia, when in reality, they were just driving in circles before heading back to Daniel's house only 15 minutes away. When they pulled into the driveway, Daniel kept the blackout goggles on Askia's face. He tied a string to Askia's wrist and led him like a blind dog out of the van and toward the house. Inside, Daniel carefully guided him through the narrow, cluttered pathways between the massive piles of hoarded trash and papers. They walked all the way to the back of the house, went down the stairs, and entered the basement. In the basement, Daniel had constructed a highly complex maze using chicken wire, stacks of old bicycles, books, and heaps of junk. This maze was specifically designed so that even if a worker came up out of the tunnels, they would be completely disoriented and would not be able to find their way out of the basement without help. Daniel led Askia through this bizarre, dark maze until they reached a gaping hole in the concrete floor. This was the entrance to the underground tunnel system. Only then did Daniel allow Askia to remove his blackout goggles. When Askia looked down into the hole, he was absolutely stunned. He saw a massive, clean, and well-lit network of tunnels stretching out in multiple directions beneath the house. He looked at Daniel in disbelief, asking how far the tunnels actually went, and Daniel proudly told him that the system was enormous. Daniel handed Askia a heavy pickaxe, a shovel, and a hard hat. Then he explained the working conditions. He told Askia that whenever he was down in the tunnels, Daniel would have to place a heavy cover over the entrance hole for security reasons. He also told Askia that because the transport process with the blindfold was so difficult, it would be much easier if Askia simply lived down in the tunnels for several days at a time. Daniel assured him that he would be perfectly comfortable. There was a mattress to sleep on, a strong Wi-Fi connection, plenty of lighting, and a 5-gallon plastic bucket to use as a toilet. Askia was uncomfortable with the idea of living in a hole in the dirt, but he trusted Daniel completely, and he was excited to be working for a millionaire whom he respected so much. So, he agreed. Over the next few months, Askia made the bizarre, blindfolded journey to Daniel's house on a regular basis. He spent days at a time underground, breathing in heavy dirt and dust as he used a pickaxe to carve new paths through the earth. But toward the end of the spring, Askia received the devastating news he had been dreading. Equity Shark had been officially rejected for the $100,000 grant. Askia was completely crushed. He also knew that he now had no way to pay back the $5,000 he owed to Daniel. He asked Daniel if he could increase his hours digging in the tunnels to slowly work off his debt. Daniel agreed. On the 10th of September 2017, Askia was back down in the tunnels. He was working in one of the deepest and lowest sections of the bunker. To reach this area, he had to squeeze his body through a very narrow and tight space. Askia had actually sent a text message to his friends earlier that day, telling them that the tunnel was making him feel incredibly claustrophobic, but he knew he had to keep going to pay off his debt. At around 4 o'clock that afternoon, while Askia was deep in the narrow tunnel, the power suddenly went completely out. Everything fell into a pitch-black silence. Upstairs in the main house, Daniel noticed the power outage. He walked down the stairs into the basement, navigated through his chicken wire maze, and located the main electrical circuit breaker. He flipped the heavy switch, and the power instantly surged back on. But as the power returned, Daniel heard a loud, high-pitched buzzing sound coming from upstairs in the kitchen. He became extremely worried that the sound was being caused by an electrical short circuit that could spark a fire. Instead of checking on Askia first, Daniel immediately reached out and flipped the main circuit breaker back off, plunging Askia back into absolute pitch-black darkness deep underground. Daniel then made his way back through the basement maze, walked up the stairs, and entered the kitchen to find the source of the buzzing sound. But as soon as he stepped into the hallway, he smelled a strong scent of smoke. He turned around and looked back down the basement stairs, and he saw thick, black smoke rapidly billowing up from the basement. Daniel ran back down the stairs and screamed out for Askia. From somewhere deep inside the pitch-black tunnels, he heard Askia's muffled voice yell back, asking what was going on. Daniel screamed for him to get out of there immediately, but the heat and the thick smoke were quickly becoming unbearable. Daniel was forced to run back up the stairs and exit the house to catch his breath in the fresh air. A few moments later, Daniel tried to go back inside. He ran down to the basement stairs, but when he reached the bottom, he did not see Askia. Instead, he saw giant orange flames leaping out of the tunnel entrance. He screamed Askia's name over and over, but there was no response. The heat was too intense, and Daniel had to flee the house. A neighbor saw Daniel standing outside in his yard, screaming hysterically as thick black smoke poured out of the windows of the home. The neighbor immediately called 911. While Daniel was pacing outside, Askia was trapped in a living nightmare. He was deep underground in total darkness. The tunnels were rapidly filling with thick, toxic smoke from the electrical fire. Askia began to crawl desperately through the narrow dirt tunnel, trying to find his way back to the main entrance. Because it was completely dark and his eyes were burning from the smoke, he kept hitting dead ends. But through sheer survival instinct, Askia miraculously managed to find his way back to the main entrance hole. He scrambled out of the hole, gasping for air, only to find himself in a basement that was completely engulfed in flames and thick smoke. This was the moment where Daniel's paranoid security measures became a death sentence. Every single time Askia had been in this basement, he had been wearing blackout goggles. He had absolutely no idea what the layout of the basement looked like. He did not know where the stairs were, and he could not see anything through the dense smoke. He was trapped inside a maze of chicken wire, towering piles of junk, and old bicycles. Desperate to escape the heat, Askia began to scramble over the chicken wire and push past the burning piles of trash. He managed to squeeze past a burning furnace, searching for any sign of an exit. In the distance, through the smoke, he saw a faint glimmer of light. It was a small basement window. Askia rushed toward the window, but as he got closer, his heart sank. Daniel had installed heavy metal security bars over the outside of the window. There was no way to squeeze through them. But Askia refused to give up. In his desperation, he grabbed an old rolling office chair from the clutter, pushed it in front of the window, and climbed on top of it. He used his bare hands to smash the glass pane, hoping he could somehow bypass the bars or scream for help. But the metal bars were set deep into the concrete foundation. They would not budge. After several agonizing minutes of fighting for his life, the toxic smoke overcame him. Askia lost consciousness, fell backward off the chair, and was consumed by the fire. When the fire department finally managed to extinguish the massive blaze, they searched the charred ruins of the basement. They found Askia's body lying directly beneath the small broken window. When investigators first questioned Daniel about why a 19-year-old boy was working in his basement, Daniel tried to downplay the situation. He lied and told the police that the basement was just a cool bachelor pad and that Askia must have simply been asleep down there when the fire started. But as fire investigators began to clear away the debris to find the cause of the fire, they discovered the entrance to the massive underground tunnel system. They were absolutely stunned by the scale of the excavation. As they mapped out the tunnels and examined the basement, they realized the horrific truth of what had happened to Askia. They realized that Daniel had essentially placed Askia into a physical death trap. When the power went out, Askia was trapped deep underground with no light and no way to know that a fire had started. By the time he managed to crawl out of the hole, the basement was already a burning inferno, and because of the chicken wire maze and the piles of hoarded junk, Askia was completely disoriented. The most tragic detail of the investigation was that when Askia was standing on that chair trying to break through the barred window, he was only 2 steps away from a door that led directly to safety. If he had only known which way to turn, he would have lived. But because he had always been blindfolded, he had no idea the door was there. The investigation also revealed that the entire house was a massive fire hazard. Daniel had run dozens of cheap extension cords and heavy-duty power strips from the main house down into the tunnels to power the lights and the Wi-Fi. The electrical system of the old house was simply not built to handle that kind of power load, which is what ultimately triggered the catastrophic electrical fire. Following an intense 8-month investigation, the state prosecutors decided to take action. They charged Daniel Beckwith with involuntary manslaughter, but they also charged him with a much more serious and rare charge in the American legal system. He was charged with second-degree depraved heart murder. This specific charge is used when a person's actions show an utter and complete disregard for the value of human life, to the point where their negligence is so extreme that it is legally treated as an intentional killing. The prosecution argued that by blindfolding Askia, forcing him to work in a dark hole with a blocked exit, and creating a physical maze in a hoarded house, Daniel had created a situation where death was almost inevitable if anything went wrong. They also pointed out that when the power went out, Daniel chose to protect his house from a potential fire by shutting off the breaker, knowingly leaving Askia trapped in the dark while the house burned. During the emotional trial, Askia's parents sat in the courtroom, weeping as they listened to the details of their son's final moments. They described Askia as a loving, ambitious boy who had his whole life ahead of him, but whose trusting nature had been exploited by a paranoid and wealthy man who cared more about his secret bunker than the safety of his workers. Daniel's defense team argued that the fire was a tragic accident and that Daniel had tried to save Askia by running back into the house. But the jury did not agree. They found Daniel guilty of both involuntary manslaughter and second-degree depraved heart murder. He was sentenced to 9 years in state prison. This case left a lasting impact on the quiet community of Bethesda. The massive tunnel system that Daniel spent years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to dig was eventually filled in with concrete by the city to prevent the surrounding homes from collapsing. Today, the property stands empty, a quiet and eerie reminder of a young man's brilliant mind that was completely destroyed by paranoia, and a tragic young victim who simply wanted to build a better life for himself, but ended up trapped in a nightmare. A young man trusted the wrong person, walked into a hidden underground world, and never made it back out. It's one of the strangest and most tragic cases in recent memory. If you want another true story that's just as unbelievable, click the next video on your screen right now. One night in December of 2009, a man was digging through a pile of papers and photo albums inside of an RV that was parked in Texas. The man had recently bought this trailer after its previous owner had died. And so now he was finding it was full of junk that he was trying to sort through. And as he rifled through the documents, he stumbled on a stack of old notebooks. He opened one up and he began to read it. And as he did, he felt his heartbeat pick up because the notebooks were actually diaries. They were full of handwritten rantings about demons and monsters and a deal with the devil. But that wasn't what scared him. What really scared the guy was this writer's horrifying confession. On the night of the 24th of July, 1987, a 30-year-old woman named Susan Woods stood at the entrance to a local fair in a little city called Hyco, located in central Texas. She was there with her best friend and her best friend's boyfriend. The three of them were just standing there trying to decide if they wanted to continue to stay or if they should just leave. As they stood there, they could hear people having fun on all the rides. There were kids laughing and screaming. It was a Friday night, and they had chosen to come here. This was supposed to be their fun activity for the evening. But so far, the night really had not been that great. Susan's best friend, a woman named Cindy Hallmark, and her boyfriend, a man named Roy Hayes, had convinced Susan to come out with them to this fair because Susan's life, of late, had been really quite bad. She was in the middle of a very ugly divorce, and the new guy that she had been dating had wound up being very pushy when it came to physical intimacy, and so she had recently dumped him too. And so Susan's life, certainly her relationships anyway, were in pretty rough shape. Cindy and Roy had convinced Susan to come out with them and, for at least one night, just come enjoy this fair. Forget about everything else and just have some fun. And so Susan had agreed to go. However, once they actually got to the fair and the three of them were walking around, playing games and going into the haunted house and doing all the things you do at a fair, it had been Cindy, not Susan, who had ultimately said that she wasn't really having a good time. She said that she just had this really intense feeling that something bad was about to happen. It was like this constant anxiety, and she just couldn't shake it, and it was making it really hard to enjoy the night. And so that was why the trio was standing at the gate, wondering if it was even worth staying any longer. Ultimately, Roy finally just said, you know what? Why don't we just leave and head back to Stephenville? That's where they all lived. It's where they grew up, too. He suggested they could go back to Stephenville and just drive around for a bit, and eventually they could go to the Dairy Queen restaurant and get some ice cream. When Roy suggested this, both Susan and Cindy thought it was a great idea. And so they left. They hopped in Roy's truck and began the drive back to Stephenville. About an hour and a half later, Susan, Cindy, and Roy walked into the Stephenville Dairy Queen. They ordered ice cream sundaes and then sat down at a booth. By this point, Cindy's feeling of dread, that feeling that something bad was going to happen, had mostly gone away. And so the mood was much lighter. And Susan especially was actually having a great night, the first one in a long time. It felt like the last 6 months or so had been some of the worst in Susan's entire life. Her ex-husband, Michael Woods, who she had been with since she was in her early 20s, had effectively abandoned her back in February. He had taken her car and also some expensive crystals that she had collected. And he had left behind a viciously mean tape recording of all the things he hated about her, along with dozens of cruel notes with insults on them hidden all over the place. And so Susan had filed for divorce. And then, instead of trying to get her car back from her husband, who was long gone, she just began doing a ton of overtime at the sandpaper factory where she worked in order to afford another car. And so in these few months immediately following the breakup with her ex, and with all this extra work she was doing, Susan had really fallen into a deep depression. But it had been Cindy and Roy who had helped her pull herself back together. Susan was naturally very shy, and she did not have a big social circle. But Cindy, on the other hand, was very extroverted, had a ton of friends, and a lot of close cousins. She had persuaded Susan to begin coming to their regular meetups with all her friends and cousins. The core group that typically attended these meetups was Cindy, Roy, Cindy's cousins, Regina and Scott Hatley, and then maybe one or two others. And collectively, they referred to themselves as the members of the round table, because often these meetups consisted of just spending the whole night sitting around Cindy's round kitchen table, talking and drinking. The first time Susan had gone, it had seemed like such a tight-knit group that she really just kind of felt like a third wheel and did not belong. But everyone had really treated her like she did belong. And these days, she did not miss a meetup because this was like her new community. It really made her happy. And so, slowly but surely, Susan had begun to feel better, largely because of these meetups. And so now, as she looked across the table at Cindy, jokingly trying to force-feed Roy all this ice cream, Susan just smiled. Roy was this big guy, but he was losing the fight, and he had chocolate sauce all over his chin. They were just kind of goofing around. And she just thought to herself, you know what? Tonight was a great night. My life is turning around. And suddenly, she had an idea. Susan stood up from the table and, without saying anything, she walked up to the counter and she promptly ordered a second hot fudge sundae. When she carried it back over to the table with a big grin on her face, Cindy and Roy kind of looked at her surprised and were kind of impressed even, which was exactly the reaction that Susan was hoping for. Normally, Susan was very conscious of her weight and wouldn't even finish one sundae. But tonight, she just felt like she had been set free. She was just going to have fun. But unfortunately for Susan, the ice cream sundaes were really the last fun thing she got to enjoy that entire weekend because she spent all day Saturday on the line at the sandpaper factory where she worked. And then all day Sunday, she was grocery shopping, doing laundry, and straightening up the house. By about 8 p.m. Sunday night, she had put away all of her laundry. She had made the bed and picked up the last few items off the bedroom floor. Her house was small, but it was finally starting to feel like hers again. When her ex-husband Michael had first left, even though he had gone 1,000 miles away to Indiana, she had felt afraid in her house like he might suddenly come back. And so she'd actually had Cindy sleep over at her house for a while to help her feel safe. And also, she asked Roy to literally nail all her windows shut. But despite fortifying her living space, what Susan couldn't escape from were all these awful little notes that Michael had left behind and hidden all over the house. All these awful messages, just basically telling Susan all these terrible things about her and how much he hated her. She kept finding them all the time. But as of right now, the house was neat and tidy. And Susan by this point believed she had found almost every note, or certainly close to every note. So, to celebrate, Susan headed over to the couch and sat down and turned on the TV. Her plan was just to watch a couple of shows and just enjoy the peace and quiet and then go to bed because tomorrow she would have to get up early for work. As she was sitting there flipping through the channels trying to figure out what she wanted to watch, she heard a knock on the front door. 2 days later, at 6 p.m. on the afternoon of July 28th, Susan's father, Joe Atkins, was at home when his phone rang. And when he picked it up, it was Susan's manager at the sandpaper factory, which was weird. The manager told him that he was calling because Susan had not shown up to work for the past 2 days and nobody could get a hold of her, and so he was wondering if Joe knew where she was. Joe frowned and said, no, he didn't know, but he would go find out. He hung up and he immediately dialed Susan's number. And when she didn't answer, he didn't think twice. He just put the phone down, grabbed his keys, hurried out to his truck, and started driving towards Susan's place. A half an hour later, Joe pulled up outside of Susan's house, and he went up to her front door. And when he knocked, nobody answered. But he could hear the TV on inside. And when he tried the doorknob, he found the door was unlocked. He opened the door up a little bit, and he poked his head inside and he called his daughter's name, but he didn't get a response. So, He stepped all the way inside. The house was basically clean, except there were snacks out on the coffee table and the TV was still on, and it was on pretty loud. But also, there were some cigarettes that had been burned out in an ashtray on the coffee table, and Joe knew his daughter didn't smoke. And so at this point, everything told him something was wrong. So Joe walked through the living room and into his daughter's bedroom. His daughter was not in there, but the bed was a mess. The sheets and the bedding had all been ripped off and were sitting in a heap on the floor, and the mattress itself was hanging off the box spring. Joe was about to leave and search the rest of the house when he noticed the bathroom door in the bedroom was open. Joe forced himself to step toward the door, and as he did, his heart began to hammer in his chest. And then when he leaned around the door and looked inside the bathroom, he just froze. For what felt like a very long time, but was very likely only a few seconds, Joe didn't move or breathe. Then it's like he broke out of his fog. He stumbled backwards. He ran to the living room, grabbed the phone, and he called 911. Sergeant Donnie Hensley of the Stephenville Police Department had just gotten home after a pretty long shift when he got a call from dispatch to head back out again. A homicide had just been called in, and every available officer had to head to the scene right away. The dispatcher did not have many details, but they did know that the victim was a young woman and that she had been found by her father inside of her home. When Hensley got to the address, he found there was an ambulance there and a couple of fire trucks and police cars and a whole bunch of police officers that were already out and about stringing up crime scene tape. But he also saw someone that he was not expecting to see. It was a friend of his, a guy he knew who volunteered at the town's golf course. His name was Joe Atkins. So he walked over and he asked Joe, hey, what are you doing here? But the instant he asked that question, and when Joe turned around to look at him, Hensley understood why he was here. He suddenly remembered that Joe had a daughter. And based on the look on Joe's face, clearly his daughter was the murder victim. Joe had found her. Hensley was a hardened detective who had been to plenty of crime scenes by this point, and he had seen some terrible things. But the pure grief on his friend's face was too much for him to bear. He knew there was nothing he could do to take Joe's pain away. So instead, without saying anything, Hensley took Joe's hands, and the two men just stood there and prayed. And then, after a few minutes, he let go of Joe's hands. And then he turned and walked up Susan's front steps to begin the search for her killer. The crime scene unit was already inside of Susan's home, hard at work by the time Detective Hensley walked through the front door. A supervisor walked over and brought Hensley up to speed. They told him that Susan's body was in the bathroom, and from the looks of it, she'd been dead for a while. The front door had been unlocked, and there was no sign of forced entry, which suggested that Susan may have let her killer inside. Detectives were now dividing up the house into quadrants to examine each part of the crime scene, and Hensley would be working primarily in the bedroom. But the supervisor warned Hensley that the crime itself was incredibly brutal, likely bordering on torture, and he should just mentally prepare himself. Hensley nodded, and for a moment he just stood there and collected himself and took stock of the scene. He looked over at the coffee table in the living room, and he saw it was covered with snacks, including a bag of potato chips, a pack of Twinkies, and an open Coke can. And there was an ashtray with 6 cigarette butts inside of it. It looked like more food and more cigarettes than one person would reasonably consume. And so maybe Susan had had company. But otherwise, the house was clean and pretty unremarkable, except for one thing that took Hensley a minute to notice. And what it was is all the windows were nailed shut from the inside. Susan clearly must have been scared of somebody breaking in. And so naturally, Hensley wondered if maybe the person she was scared of breaking in was the same person who wound up killing her. But if that was the case, why had she apparently opened the door for this person? At this point, Hensley moved into the bedroom. And as soon as he did, he could tell there had to have been a struggle in here because the mattress was hanging off the box spring, the sheets had been pulled off, and they were heaped up on the floor. And there were all these scuff marks on the floor that suggested the bed very likely had been moved, dragged around inside of the room. There was also a white extension cord lying on the mattress. And also, there was this pillow that had all these strange black smudges on it. Hensley walked over and looked at this pillowcase, trying to figure out what the smudges could be, and then he realized it was mascara. The pillow must have been held over Susan's face to suffocate her. But when Hensley walked into the bathroom and saw what was in there, despite the warning he was given about how brutal it was, he still was taken aback and found himself gasping. Susan's body was draped over the side of the tub with her head still in the water. At first glance, it was obvious Susan was dead because her head and shoulders that were underwater were severely decomposed from being in the water. And so at this point, Hensley realized that whoever murdered Susan had likely sexually assaulted her, strangled her, smothered her, and then held her body underwater. This had been a savage attack committed by a monster. However, Hensley also realized that this monster, whoever had done this, had made at least one mistake because one of the crime scene techs that was in the bathroom was pointing at the tub with excitement. And when Hensley looked at what they were pointing at, you could see perfectly clearly there was a set of palm prints almost certainly left behind by the killer. The following morning, at around 10 a.m., Sergeant Hensley walked into the Stephenville police station and promptly filled up a paper cup from the bullpen water cooler and drank it down. It was over 90 degrees outside, and he had just spent all morning and a lot of the previous night canvassing the neighborhood where Susan had been murdered. But despite all their efforts, they really hadn't gotten much. Susan had been found on Tuesday, but nobody had reported seeing her on Tuesday or the Monday before or the Sunday before, which left a window of 3 days for this murder to have taken place. One of Susan's neighbors did remember seeing a, quote, large-framed man park his truck near Susan's house on Sunday night, but that described a lot of the men in Stephenville, so that didn't really narrow anything down. Now, the police chief had not yet assigned a lead investigator to Susan's case, but because Sergeant Hensley knew Susan's father personally, he was hoping to stay involved. So, after drinking a second cup full of water, Hensley headed down the hall to the chief's office where he asked to see Susan's autopsy report. The chief's secretary handed it over, and Hensley quickly began to thumb through the pages, but he quickly realized there really was almost nothing here that he didn't already know. The report confirmed that Susan had been sexually assaulted, but her body was so decomposed it was impossible to determine exactly how or when she had died. Although the coroner estimated she'd been in the tub for roughly 2 days. But right at that moment, another investigator named Lieutenant Ken Maltby walked up and grabbed the report right out of Hensley's hands. And before Hensley could protest, Maltby walked back to the bullpen and rapped his knuckles on a doorframe to get everybody's attention. Then Maltby announced that he would be taking over Susan's case. So everybody else, Hensley included, should back off. And Hensley did not like this. Not only because he had this closeness with Susan's father, but also because he had a feeling that Maltby was only interested in this case because he thought it would help his career. However, Maltby outranked Hensley, and Hensley already had a full caseload of work. So there really was very little he could do here. So, with a resigned sigh, he headed back to his desk. 2 days later, around 2 p.m. on July 31st, Sergeant Hensley stood in the back of a small crowd, sweating through his suit as Susan's casket was lowered into the ground. Hensley was at this funeral really to support Susan's father, Joe, because he was not really a part of the investigation. However, he couldn't help scanning the mourners through a detective's lens to see if anybody seemed suspicious. There was a group of people in their 20s and 30s that were standing towards the front, and Hensley assumed they must be Susan's friends. He remembered what one of Susan's neighbors had said about a large-framed man, and he looked at all the men, taking note of their size. At the center of the group, there was a blonde woman who was sobbing. And Hensley recognized her as Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, who was leaning on her boyfriend, Roy Hayes. The two of them had actually come to the crime scene by coincidence on the day Susan's body was found, and they had totally broken down when they realized what had happened. But now, Hensley was suddenly noticing just how physically enormous Roy was. And so in that moment, Hensley thought to himself, if he was in charge of this case, he knew Roy would be somebody he'd take a close look at. But that was not his decision. But then Hensley noticed that there was actually one person who was conspicuously absent from this funeral, and that was Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. From what Hensley had heard around the station, nearly all of Susan's friends and family were convinced that it was Michael who was the killer. But there was a problem with this theory. Michael lived 1,000 miles away in Indianapolis. And word around the police station was that during that window of time where Susan was murdered over those 3 days, Michael was in Indianapolis and he was around loads of people who would vouch for him being in Indianapolis. Which meant that as far as Hensley knew, there really was no way for Michael to be the killer. And so Hensley just hoped that Lieutenant Maltby had another better suspect in mind. For the next few weeks, Sergeant Hensley focused on his own cases while still keeping tabs on Susan's. Every couple of days, her dad would call him up and ask why Michael hadn't been arrested yet. And Hensley would always tell him that the case was in good hands, and they're working on it. But as the weeks passed by with no arrests, Hensley started to wonder, what was going on here? Something needs to happen. Why is nothing happening? Then, one day in early October, so roughly 2 months after Susan's murder, Hensley walked into the bullpen to find Maltby celebrating. Not because of any progress in the case, though, but to celebrate his big promotion. Maltby was going to be the lead of a new narcotics unit, and his open cases that he had been working on were just going to be given to other investigators or filed away altogether. And so as Maltby accepted congratulations from other officers and just made a whole scene, all Sergeant Hensley could think was, well, what's going to happen to Susan's case? It could easily fall through the cracks here. And so without even talking to Maltby, Hensley walked straight to the chief's office and asked to take the case over. The chief shrugged and just said, sure, you're welcome to try, so long as this case does not get in the way of his other work. Hensley agreed and then went to get Susan's file. And then, after he had it in hand, he hurried back to his desk and began rifling through the pages. And he was stunned to find that there was almost nothing in there besides the original autopsy report. And that's when Hensley remembered that Lieutenant Maltby claimed to have this photographic memory. And so he almost never took notes. And so Hensley was basically going to have to start all over from square one. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Sergeant Hensley sat down in the kitchen of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, as Cindy poured them both a cup of coffee. And then Cindy started talking. And she had a lot to say. She was absolutely convinced that Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, was the killer. And she just could not understand why it was taking detectives so long to arrest him. Cindy said, for most of Susan and Michael's relationship, Michael was just kind of a loser. He couldn't keep a job, and he'd just lift weights and play guitar shirtless in the front yard. However, when they had broken up, Michael had recorded this totally unhinged audio recording about how awful Susan was and left it for Susan, along with all these notes he had hid all around the house and the property, which also just said terrible things about Susan. And this behavior by Michael had scared Susan so much that she had asked Cindy and Cindy's boyfriend Roy to help nail all her windows shut, specifically to prevent Michael from coming into the house. Hensley listened and wrote everything Cindy said down, but he really wasn't as sold on the Michael Woods theory as everybody else in Stephenville seemed to be. And that was primarily because the police in Indianapolis had spoken to Michael, and apparently he had given them a rock-solid alibi. And so, realistically, it didn't make sense for him to be the killer. That said, Hensley was pretty confident that the killer had to be somebody Susan knew. The lack of forced entry, coupled with all the snacks and the Coke can and cigarettes on her coffee table, suggested that Susan might have entertained her murderer before they killed her. And so at this point, Hensley was much more interested in learning if there were other romantic interests in Susan's life, besides Michael. And when he asked Cindy that question, she said, yeah, there was one other guy. She said right before Susan was killed, she was seeing this bartender named J.C. Bowman. However, they'd only gone on a few dates. Cindy said that J.C. had put a lot of pressure on Susan to sleep with him, and so she had just broken up with him. And when Hensley heard this, he felt like this was really promising. And so when Cindy finished telling her JC's story, he asked her if she knew where he could find JC. And she said, yeah. And she gave him the address of the bar where he worked. 45 minutes later, Sergeant Hensley pulled up in front of the bar. It was still too early for business, but there was a delivery truck out front, and there were a few men who were unloading kegs and bringing them inside. And so Hensley walked up to these guys, and he asked if any of them knew a J.C. Bowman. And this tall, bearded man raised his hand and said, "Actually, that was him." A few minutes later, Hensley and J.C. were sitting at the empty bar. Hensley watched J.C.'s face very closely as he explained to him that he was here to talk about Susan. J.C. nodded and ran his fingers through his hair like he was nervous. And then he said his throat was dry and asked Sergeant Hensley if he wanted something to drink. Sergeant Hensley said he was okay. But J.C. got up, went behind the bar, and then came back with a can of Coke. And after sitting down and opening the drink up and taking a sip, J.C. also lit up a cigarette. And so immediately, Hensley thought of the Coke can that was on Susan's coffee table, as well as the ashtray full of cigarettes, despite the fact that Susan was not a smoker. And so the interview had barely even started, and Hensley was already very suspicious of J.C. So he decided to push pretty early and see how J.C. reacted under some serious pressure. And so right out the gate, he asked J.C. where he was on Sunday, July 26th, which was the day investigators at this point believed Susan was murdered based primarily on the autopsy report. And when J.C. was asked that, he swallowed and said he couldn't remember, which was possible. I mean, the murder happened 2 months earlier, but it didn't make J.C. look that good. So Hensley asked J.C. if it was true that he and Susan broke up ultimately because he, J.C., had pressured her for sex. J.C. turned beet red and said he had never pressured Susan. He said they had been intimate, but just once in Susan's bathtub. And when Hensley heard this, he nearly dropped his pen. It seemed extremely suspicious that J.C. was claiming to have been intimate with Susan in the same bathtub where she was found dead. And so Hensley wondered if he was maybe trying to get ahead of the fact that his fingerprints would be found on or in that bathtub. Now, legally, Hensley knew he could not compel J.C. to offer up his fingerprints without charging him first, but he took a chance and just asked anyway. And to his surprise, J.C. said, "Yes, you can have my fingerprints," and he almost seemed relieved. He said, "Whatever you need to help solve Susan's murder, I'll do it." 2 hours later, Sergeant Hensley was back at his desk in the Stephenville police station looking at a card that had J.C.'s finger and palm prints on it. And as he looked at it, he began thinking about those palm prints on Susan's bathtub. In 1987, fingerprints and palm prints were just much slower to process than they are today. And the closest lab that analyzed these prints was an hour and a half away in Fort Worth. And Hensley knew they were always working with a backlog. So his results could easily take months. But Hensley was not going to just sit around and wait because he had one more suspect he wanted to talk to. The following afternoon, Sergeant Hensley walked into an interrogation room at the police station and sat down across from Roy Hayes, who was Susan's best friend, Cindy's boyfriend. Hensley wanted to speak to Roy for 2 reasons. One, he matched the physical description of the large man seen near Susan's house around the time of her murder. And 2, there just weren't that many people who were close to Susan, and Roy saw her when she was both with Cindy and also when she would attend those members of the Round Table get-togethers. Now, that was not that incriminating, but Hensley knew that catching the killer was as much about ruling suspects out as it was about ruling them in. So that was really all he was trying to do here with Roy, is just maybe find a way to say, nope, not him. But before Hensley could even begin asking Roy questions, Roy just started talking. He told Hensley that he had been thinking about Susan's case nonstop. He said that his mind had been running wild with all the possible ways the killer could have gotten inside. And so now Roy was eager to share his theories. After all, he said he was the one who nailed those windows shut. So he knew where the weaknesses in her house were. And so Hensley said, "Okay, let's hear your theories." And Roy began listing all the ways a person might be able to get inside of Susan's house, including what Roy said was the most promising, which was a 6-inch crack in the window above the kitchen sink. And as Roy did this, all of a sudden, he was at the top of Hensley's suspect list. And when Roy was done rattling off all the ways he would break into Susan's house, Hensley asked him, "Where were you on the evening of Sunday, July 26th, and Hensley watched as Roy's expression changed from very intense to surprised as he realized he was now being asked for his own alibi. Roy started stumbling over another very long, rambly answer, and what he had to say ultimately just made him look even more guilty because Roy told Hensley that on the night Susan was killed, he had been over at a friend's house playing a game called Dungeons & Dragons. So today, people know Dungeons & Dragons as a harmless fantasy role-playing game. But at this time in 1987, it was viewed very differently. In the late 1980s in America, there was this huge fear that certain games, books, and heavy metal songs were all linked to devil worship. The TV news ran regular stories across the country about how Dungeons & Dragons specifically encouraged players to cast spells and practice witchcraft. And the local paper in Stephenville had carried a full-page ad calling the game satanic. So when Roy told Hensley he had been playing Dungeons & Dragons on the night Susan was killed, Hensley immediately thought back to the horrible brutality of the crime scene. And he wondered if maybe Susan's murder could have been tied to some kind of dark ritual. And so Hensley looks at Roy and says, "Okay, well, are you prepared to give us your fingerprints?" And Roy said, "Yeah." A half an hour later, a very disappointed Sergeant Hensley watched Roy walk away from the station. Just like with JC, Roy had seemed incredibly suspicious at the start of the interview, but then he'd easily offered up his fingerprints like he wasn't concerned at all about whether they'd match the killers. So Hensley was not sure what to expect in terms of results here. But he still sent Roy's prints off to the outside lab to be added to the queue behind JC's. Hensley was contemplating his next move when the station receptionist walked over and said that someone from the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department was on the line for him. They were following up on the inquiry he had made a few days earlier to double-check the alibi of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. Hensley eagerly ran to the phone, and when he heard what the officer had to say, he practically jumped out of his chair. Because according to the Indianapolis police officer, it was true that Michael said he had an alibi with lots of witnesses, but he had promised to provide the names and contact information for all those witnesses, and he had never done it. Which meant Michael's alibi, the same one Stephenville police used to rule him out as a suspect. Or, more specifically, they used the idea of his alibi, the belief that his alibi existed. That's what they used to rule him out. Well, clearly, it was totally... Lieutenant Ken Maltby, who was in charge of the case when this decision was made, had just completely dropped the ball. Somebody had to check Michael's alibi. On a bright morning in April of 1988, Sergeant Hensley walked out of the Indianapolis International Airport with a single duffel bag of luggage slung over his shoulder. He was here to try to collect the fingerprints of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, who was now Hensley's primary suspect. Hensley had been trying to coordinate the investigation into Michael from Stephenville, Texas, but it had proven to be kind of cumbersome, and so he decided to just take matters into his own hands and actually go to Indianapolis. He knew Michael did not have to submit to fingerprinting unless he was charged with a crime. So Hensley had come up with a plan. He was going to put Michael under surveillance and wait for him to do something illegal. Maybe he gets into a fight or an altercation, or he buys some marijuana, or even jaywalked, anything. Hensley would use it as an excuse to arrest him and get his prints. For days, Hensley sat in an unmarked van outside the house where Michael lived, watching the front door through a telephoto camera lens. But Michael and his roommates seemed pretty boring. They barely even left the house. Hensley was beginning to think that his big plan to catch Michael doing something illegal was a huge waste of time. It just was not going to happen. But then, one morning, he noticed some unusual activity in Michael's front yard. Michael and his roommates were laying out furniture and clothing on their front lawn, clearly getting ready for a yard sale. Sergeant Hensley was snapping photos of everything they were bringing out. And at one point, he saw something that gave him a rush of excitement because, through his lens, he spotted these crystal figurines that appeared to be the exact same type of crystal figurines that Michael had allegedly stolen from Susan's house in Stephenville when their marriage had ended and he had left to go to Indianapolis. Hensley practically laughed out loud. I mean, this was too easy. This was his chance. So he called the local police, and they stormed the yard sale, and they arrested Michael for theft. 2 weeks later, now back in Stephenville, Sergeant Hensley walked into the police station to start a shift, and he found a manila envelope waiting for him. It had a return address that said it was from the Texas DPS crime lab in Fort Worth, Texas, where he had sent all of the suspects' fingerprints. Hensley ripped open the envelope and dumped the contents onto the table. And as he began looking through them, he realized the lab had already analyzed all 3 sets of prints that he had sent in. They were Susan's ex-boyfriend J.C. Bowman, her best friend's boyfriend Roy Hayes, and her ex-husband Michael Woods. Now, at this point, if Hensley had had to guess who the killer was, he would have guessed Michael. Because Michael is this enraged ex-husband who had left behind these terrible recordings and notes, and he had spooked Susan so badly at the end of their relationship, she had nailed her windows shut to keep him out. And then also, his alibi was sort of up in the air. They didn't really know if he had one or not. They hadn't been able to actually verify it or not yet. JC also had basically no alibi. He drank Coke and he smoked cigarettes just like the killer had left in Susan's living room, or is believed to have been the killer who left those behind. And Roy, in virtue of playing Dungeons and Dragons, could potentially be involved in Satanism. And also, he seemed way too eager to talk about how he might break into Susan's house. However, for Hensley, he felt like one of these 3 men is the killer. He's about to get his answer. But as he read through each of these reports, he went from exhilaration to confusion and finally just total disbelief because none of these prints that he'd submitted matched the ones from Susan's tub. Hensley wanted so badly to solve this case, to give Susan's father, Joe, his friend, some closure, but now he felt like he was totally out of ideas. Susan's case ultimately went completely cold. Sergeant Hensley retired and 19 years passed by. And then one day, in early 2006, Lieutenant Don Miller of the Stephenville Police Department took a box labeled Susan Woods down from a shelf in evidence storage, carried it back to his office, sat down at his desk, and began to look through its contents. Miller had recently been tasked with reviewing the department's unsolved cases, including Susan's. He read all of Sergeant Hensley's notes. He studied the crime scene photos, and he reviewed all the witness statements. None of it looked very promising. In fact, it looked like all the suspects had basically been ruled out. But then he saw those palm prints that had been lifted from Susan's bathtub, which had never been matched to anyone. And he had an idea. Back in 1987, there had been no centralized database of fingerprints. This meant that unless you had a specific suspect to compare an unknown print against, the unknown print was effectively useless. And that's really what had happened in Susan's case. None of the suspects had matched this unknown print. So, the case was put on a shelf. But in 2006, the FBI now had a national database of all the fingerprints of everybody in America who had ever been arrested and fingerprinted. And this meant that if Susan's killer had ever been arrested for any crime anywhere, their fingerprints would likely be in that database. Now, Lieutenant Miller did not have the budget or the time for a full-blown reinvestigation here. But he certainly had the time and money to just submit those prints into this FBI database to just see if there was a hit. So he submitted them and then put her case file back in storage. And sure enough, a few days later, Miller was at his desk when his phone rang, and it was the FBI, and they told him they had found a match. But when the FBI agent told Miller the name of the person whose prints these matched, it meant nothing to Miller. He didn't think he'd actually even heard the name before, and the person had been arrested for robbery in Nevada, not Texas. Miller thanked the agent, and he quickly began digging through this person's history, and he also went and got the Susan Woods case file. And slowly but surely, it all began to come together. And as Miller read through in her file all the names of the people that Susan spent her time with, he noticed something. And finally, it all just clicked. Lieutenant Miller had found the killer. Based on evidence collected at the crime scene and the killer's written confession, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Susan Woods on the evening of Sunday, July 26, 1987. Stephenville's main street was busy as the killer drove through town in their brown pickup, sipping a mixture of soda, vodka, and cough syrup. They stared out their window at all the happy people in the restaurants and the storefronts. And as they stared at these people, a darkness stirred inside the killer. This darkness had been there for years, telling the killer they were no good and they would never be close to anyone. Alcohol was the only thing that seemed to make this darkness go away. So, the killer stayed half-drunk most of the time. But sometimes, even the alcohol wasn't enough. A few years back, when the TV news had been running non-stop with talk about devil worshipping, the killer had been sort of inspired, and they thought they might try that. And so, they had lit a bunch of candles and set them around their room in the shape of a pentagram. And then the killer stripped off their clothes. They stretched out on the floor and they offered up their soul to the devil in exchange for freedom from this darkness. But unfortunately, the darkness remained. And so now the killer, feeling very riled up, took another drink and thought of Susan and the way she'd smiled at them the last time they had seen each other. The killer had not had the courage to make a move back then. But now, with this buzz that they had from their drink, they really couldn't see a good reason not to make a pass at Susan. So they turned off the main road, and they drove the short distance to Susan's house. In a matter of minutes, the killer was at her door, knocking. Susan opened the door, and surprise flashed across her face, but then it softened into a smile, and she told them to come on in. Susan told them to get comfortable, and as they sat down on the couch, she went to the kitchen to get the killer a Coke and some snacks. Then she brought them back, and she sat down on the couch next to the killer to talk and catch up. And that was when the killer made their move. They leaned in to kiss her, but Susan immediately pulled back. Suddenly angry, the killer grabbed her and Susan slapped them across the face. And right then, the killer exploded. It would take almost 20 years. But that single action of the killer placing their hands on the bathtub did eventually give Lieutenant Miller the killer's identity. He was the younger cousin of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark. And he was one of the members of that roundtable group who supported Susan through her divorce. He had also been at Susan's funeral and helped her friends through the aftermath of her death. The killer's name was Scott Hatley. And just a week before he killed her, he had been hanging out with the members of the roundtable. And Susan was there. And Susan, who was this, very shy, gentle person, had sort of opened up around this group. She was feeling happier and happier, largely because this group of friends, including Scott, had been so supportive. She really felt like she belonged here and was safe here. And during that meeting amongst the members of the round table, just sort of inexplicably, Susan had looked over at Scott and simply smiled at him. And for that reason, pretty much alone, Scott, a week later, had shown up on her doorstep and murdered her. By the time Lieutenant Miller put all of this together, Hatley was 41 years old and was still a free man. And so, on the 7th of June 2006, Miller had him arrested and charged him with Susan's murder. He would ultimately take a plea deal and was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but would only serve 11 years before he was released for good behavior. However, 3 years after Hatley got out of prison, he was found dead inside of his RV from cancer complications. And among his things, investigators would find this handwritten diary where he confessed to Susan's murder. The pages were also filled with references to Satan and demons. And Hatley specifically wrote that some kind of outside presence had been responsible for pushing him to ultimately assault and kill Susan. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.